Yo, what's good, Shinobi Nation? Welcome back to Just a Shinobi, the home of the craziest Naruto What Ifs. Today we're jumping into part 3 of What If Naruto was trapped in a time loop. So strap in, because things are about to get explosive. If you're new to the channel, make sure to smash that subscribe button, hit the bell so you don't miss the next chapter, and share this video with your whole ninja squad. And of course, drop your theories in the comments. Your support is what keeps this shinobi grinding. The third test had come. Sasuke had been late, as before, delaying his own match by hours as the sun moved across the horizon enough for Shikamaru to use in his own fight. Naruto had dropped enough poison gas bombs around Neji to strangle a horse, which was actually fairly easy. An appalling percentage of their body volume was lungs, and those still had to pump like bellows to keep the rest of that creature moving at the velocities they did. Safe in his too tight armor, the gas had done him no harm because of the built-in breath mask, so Naruto had won that round with amazing ease. At least something had gone right. Much hadn't. It had been so long Naruto had basically forgotten about the invasion. In an abstract sort of sense he'd recalled it, but he'd failed to plan for it to any meaningful degree, and so that had gone poorly. Trying to save the Hokage and stop Gaara both at once without previous planning, Naruto had managed to do either. Orochimaru had knocked him out quickly with wounds that could have killed anyone else. His clones had stood up bravely to Gaara, but in his advanced demon mode as he was, it was all they could do just to slow him down. The village had been all but destroyed by the invasion forces. Many shops and buildings got leveled, high-level ninja destroyed, and the streets littered with debris. And on top of everything else, when Naruto woke up under Anko's care outside of the infirmary, there having been no room for him within, he'd asked, and she'd been forced to answer that in spite of his performance during the test, and the valuable contribution he'd made to the fight after, the village had elected not to promote him to. But why? The blonde called out his query in anguish of soul. Anko sympathized, she really did. But the kid had to be grounded in reality, so telling him everything was going to be alright was a lie, and that left only a colder form of comfort for her to offer. You know, kid, don't worry about it too much. Chunin tests are as much of a popularity contest as anything. Look at me, why don't you? She gave him a self-deprecating shrug, allowing a moment of letting him see a fleeting glimpse of the vulnerability she had inside, under her tough gal exterior. I could take almost any in this town, most of them I could beat 2 or 3 on 1. I could beat half of them while they were drunk or hungover. But I'm only a special. You want to know why? My old teacher got into some freaky stuff that made himself so unpopular he got thrown out, and his reputation hangs in the air around me like a stink. There's nothing that I can do to get rid of it. People suspect I might have been brainwashed, that I'm a sleeper agent he's just waiting to activate. And you know what? She shrugged. I can't say they might not be right. I've got gaps in my memories of my time with him, and that's a bad sign. She paused for a moment, considering, before popping him a genuine smile, albeit a slight one. But probably not. This whole invasion was the sort of thing you use sleeper agents to prepare for. We only survived by a thread, so this was a finishing move meant to kill us. If he didn't activate me for this, then I'm almost certainly not his pawn. The lady stretched, and gave him a sad smile. Hey, you gotta find your comfort where you can. She sobered instantly, and informed him, still, this town hates him and everything about him. Now you've seen good reasons as to why. The former apprentice of Orochimaru turned her gaze off into the distance, and heaved a big sigh. But you know what? That's nothing compared to Kyuubi. However much they may hate and fear my old teacher, that doesn't even make a dent in how much they hate and fear it. Naruto absently blurted out while his mind was still caught up in the shocked horror of having been denied promotion after so much work. Huh! His teacher found herself thrown off track. Naruto tapped the side of his skull. The demon fox is in a coma just now, and it wasn't too hard to slip inside the bars of her cage. So, while checking over the thing's wounds, I lifted up the tails, just to see. She's a girl, not like it matters any. Okay, the special blinked several times, somehow put off by that thought, but she quickly rallied, getting back on topic. Face it, kid, Anko told him bluntly. People don't see you, they see the fox. And they hate the fox. You need Kage-grade skills to make rank in this town. You're too much like me, surrounded by a hate you did nothing to deserve. In spite of whatever skills I gain, I don't expect that I'll ever have more rank than I do now. I'm amazed they let me get this far, actually. And I suspect Sarutobi had something to do with protecting me from even more blocked promotions than I already suffered. Since they hate you more than they've ever hated me, she sighed, before admitting a harsh truth to him. I think you'd better get used to being a genin. With that, she left him alone with his thoughts. Naruto was left behind miserable, until he thought about it a few seconds more. He'd need to have Kage grade skills, huh? Well then, he'd get them. It was almost a relief when he woke up in the morning to face the first test of the exam, all bright and early in a fresh and undamaged town, the Hokage back alive and every possibility once more placed before him. The boy smiled widely. If being Kage level was the only way to achieve the promotion he felt would get him out of this time loop, he'd do it. No problem. He'd wanted to do it anyway, ever since he could remember. And seeing that battle over again had given him tons of new ideas. The boy threw himself into his training with a fervor and passion unknown to him for quite some while. He was going to be Hokage. Let's see, that meant being stronger and faster, and he couldn't do that through training. He'd have to have some kind of chakra boost to his body, something like Kiba's family did. And come to think of it, he'd need an honest way to face Kiba and win. You! Naruto threw open the door to the kennel and pointed a finger at Hana Inuzuka, Kiba's older sister. I need your clan techniques. The woman smirked, not pausing in brushing her dog. Sorry, kid, this is not going to happen. They are for our clan members only. No exceptions. The boy thought about it furiously for a second, before approaching and pressing himself nose to nose with her. Marry me. At this, the female dog ninja broke out in barking laughter. No way. Not gonna happen. Go sniff around someone your own age, brat. Naruto! Hana shouted out, awash in pleasure, before surging up off of the couch and grabbing him by his lapels. Marry me! Of course, I'd love to, he agreed demurely, setting aside the massage oil to take her in a hug, giving a wink to the clones in the background who went on playing soft music in the string quartet they had formed. The clones in the kitchen cooking food pumped fists while those presently designing her outfits amid the scented candles paused to give each other high fives. But I wouldn't want to feel like an outcast on the inside, he murmured. I've already had enough of that from the rest of Konoha. So really I couldn't agree unless I was going to be taught clan techniques. The older woman dragged him down to enjoy a fierce, animalistic kiss full of fire before releasing him just an inch to proclaim proudly, in a low growl, one of our bitches just had a litter of pups. She's a good bitch. You can get a quality familiar out of her lot, who are just going to be trained up as general replacements anyway. And I'll start teaching you the rest of our techniques tonight. Tonight? The boy feigned surprise, as he was allergic to delays and wanted things now whenever possible. Why not right now? Because we're going to be busy, she declared, dragging him back down before the startled boy could even yelp. The two then began a make-out session that put her scent all over his body, marking him clearly as her property. The boy had discovered that water techniques were now coming to him more easily than most others. Part of the reason why was easy to guess, as his primary form of chakra control training lately had been that A and BU level river thing, soaking the water with his chakra. Well, he'd finished that book now, and the suggestions it gave were few in specifics, but wide in generalities, bunches of theories but little practical value, which made it no wonder it was still on those shelves while the others had been checked out. Still, theory was good for something, and Naruto knew just what he wanted to do. There was a great deal more wind around Konoha than there was water, so he planted himself atop the Hokage monument, and began adapting that same river exercise to the passing winds, filling them with his chakra so he could watch those patterns as they dispersed. Not about to be tied down to any one idea for long, the next day he was also sitting on rocks, letting his chakra flow out of him into the ground, seeping into every cavity, vein, and crevice. It didn't move like water or air, but there was so much there, minerals all reacting in slightly different ways to his chakra infusion, that there was much to learn. The day after, he was sitting atop of one of the town's power transformers, allowing his chakra to seep out along the electrical lines and listen to the flow of that kind of energy, as it got transmitted along. That left only one element uncovered, and to his surprise he found that one the easiest of all. He'd been troubled over how to do that same thing without getting burned, as in every other case he'd had to be actually touching the energy, or very close to it, to perform the exercise. No. No problem. It was initially scary, and at first he'd been all prepared to have clones pull him back. But once a fire was completely infused with his chakra, he could influence it not to burn him anymore, convince it to send its heat elsewhere, and by doing so not get scorched or set ablaze. And that discovery kicked all of those exercises up to the next level. Soon he found himself adjusting the air currents in the wind in minor ways, then he began to do the same with water, and when he turned that to the power lines, well, things got interesting, as he learned he could tell it not to go one way over another, and by doing so cut off power to entire buildings. Earth was harder to figure out an advanced exercise for, until he began to think of Gaara's sand. While he couldn't move it the same way as the red-haired vessel, when he dribbled it out of his fingers he could let the grains fall in very specific ways, so that one mineral fell to one side, and others to their own. In this way he could play in a sandbox and by dribbling the sand out of his fist create a mound of sand particles, with one side of it a glittering pile of tiny metal dust motes that had been part of the mix. Starved for progress, and seeing it at last, the boy would send clones out every day to do each exercise in a handful of different places so he could do all of his elemental training simultaneously. Some clones would be placed up or down the river, others feeling the wind from atop the Hokage monument, buildings, or trees. Earth was in plentiful supply, although electrical power was not overabundant. However, he could make as many fires as he wanted. By sending a handful of clones out to do each element simultaneously, he did gain some benefit out of doing the multiple training thing, too. Some would be on Earth, others fire, and so on, so that each day he'd gain progress on all of them, and how welcome that progress was. His chakra control began shooting higher, until he was back to where Ebisu would call him decent, almost average, which opened up his whole range of battle techniques for use in stressful situations again. All 30 of them, plus those that Anko had taught to him. Better still, while he had his limiters on, he had close enough to good control to qualify for much better medical knowledge and skills. So, having his chakra powers back, Naruto also sent clones out to use and master them, using those same principles and exercises that Ebisu taught him for perfecting his basic 3. He didn't just send out clones to use his battle jutsu either, but also his camping techniques and the essential 8, so he was effectively training to perfect each of them all day every day. No need to waste time, and being free of the infinite reset loops, even just having been out into that extra month, had res-parked some of his creativity that had been smothering under the weight of infinite repeating sameness. What's more, having chakra control sufficient to use his advanced special powers in battle without those fragile limiters, he was no longer trapped in a single week and a day. He faced both of the Gaara and Kiba fights just to prove to himself that he could. That he could now beat those two, who'd previously been all but insurmountable obstacles to his progress. Deciding he still wanted to play with his new and better equipment, Naruto wore it to the fight against Kiba, and the dog user, as he took his place opposite him, called out as before, "You think no one's ever used a stink bomb on my family before, Uzumaki? I could smell you carrying those bombs before we even went into the forest." "I know," Naruto replied calmly, even confidently, gazing evenly at his friend. "I knew you could smell everything that I possess, from my poison packets to the number of kunai I'm carrying, and what dye I used on my clothes. Just as I know you've got an almost symbiotic relationship with your familiar dog, to the point where you have begun to share each other's traits. I know that you can understand his barking. I know of your man-beast clone technique, and allow me to say that I admire your execution of it. I know you typically begin fights using your beast mimicry technique, which grants you extra strength and speed above your already admirable levels. I know that you are very loyal, Kiba, and I believe that you truly do deserve to be a however." The blonde boy gave his friend a shrug. "Unfortunately, that's not going to happen. Not this test, at any rate. But I have confidence you'll pass the next one. You just had the misfortune of facing me this time." At Kiba's stunned and somewhat truculent stare, Naruto gave an earnest shrug. "Sorry, bad time to tell you I once dated your sister, I guess. She was pretty vocal about your clan's techniques." The dog user's face turned to one of cold fury, and he pounded one fist into his palm. "You're going to pay for that, Uzumaki." "Begin!" the head examiner cried, slashing his arm downward before the fight could start without him. Instantly Naruto formed a single seal, when usually it called for several, and shouted out, "Earth Flow River!" The floor of the examination room instantly turned to deep, thick, slick mud, on which Kiba had trouble retaining his balance, slipping about frantically for a moment before plopping face first into the mire. He looked up with a mud-covered face, sunk up to his wrists and knees in the muck and about to brag that he could fight just fine on all fours, and that it was a much more stable position that wouldn't mind a little mud, but Naruto, who'd been standing above the surface of it on pads of chakra, had already completed his next seal. And he vanished. Startled, Kiba started looking around to the sides, up the walls, trying to see or even smell where the attack was coming from, but he only had a fraction of a second, and it was all to no avail. The next moment Kiba and his dog Akamaru were both sucked down into the ground, leaving only their heads above it, and the mud instantly hardened, turning back to a stone floor again. Inner decapitation technique, used along with and after the underground move, Naruto explained from where he was now standing safely behind and out of reach of the helpless dog user and his pet. Walking around to the front, he squatted down to apologize. "I'm sorry, Kiba. You truly deserve to win. You are strong, and I believe our village needs you as a. Frankly, I think your whole team is due for promotion. However, you got me as an opponent, and you just couldn't beat me. But I hope we can be friends." Naruto reached into his pouch and pulled out the scroll of earth techniques he'd taken from Sasuke's apartment. Placing it on the floor before Kiba's face, he said, "This is the scroll I got my earth techniques from. I'd like to let you borrow it for as long as you like." He gave an apologetic shrug to the other boy. "I'd even be glad to help you master them. Think of it as kind of a consolation prize. I can't give you rank, but I can help you on your way next time, not that I think you'll need any." The whole time the dog user had been glaring around in shame, trying to avoid meeting Naruto's eyes. Finally he gave a sigh and nodded, turning his face back to Naruto's and matching his friendly grin. "All right. You've got a deal." But then his face turned stern and he growled. "But if you hurt my sister?" He left the threat dangling. "Furthest thing from my mind," Naruto told him honestly. After all, while he could perform those clan techniques now, he still needed tutoring on how to more fully master them. And dang, but if a sense of smell made 1,000 times more powerful by chakra wasn't one of the most useful espionage tools ever. How has anyone ever kept any secrets from these guys? "Winner Naruto Uzumaki," the head examiner declared, and only then did Naruto draw his friend out of the entrapping earth, slap the scroll into his hands, and rub shoulders in the clan way so they bore each other's scent. Kiba was surprised, but soon started grinning, and the two boys left the stage laughing together, dog yipping excitedly along beside them, none of them interested in remaining to see the other fights. A month of being friends with Kiba and training and dating his sister was also an astonishingly good experience. Naruto was not used to loyalty, he never had any, well, except for Hinata, but the Inuzuka clan were of a different sort. As bold as he was, as unashamed of their opinions as he was, and every bit tenacious enough to turn and growl at the whole village for treating him wrong once they'd begun to accept him as one of their own. That was a totally new experience for him, and one that he resolved to do often. Although, when the invasion came, as it did once again at the end of that month, he was far more conscious of the losses Kiba's family took, and it hurt him to see such a nice family so heavily reduced. So he put that on his list of things to fix on future trips around. Once he figured out what he was going to do about the invasion, that is. In his excitement over effectively having a family for the first time ever, he had forgotten to plan for that again. It was going to take one heck of a plan, Naruto decided, as Orochimaru once again met him in a hurricane of fists and feet, instantly pulverizing his defenses and smacking him down off of the building to smash on the street, spurting blood as he impacted and creating a small crater in the road, ending his resistance for that reset in spite of his tremendous healing ability. The trouble was clearly centered around the snake. The guy was tough, unbelievably hard to beat, and ruthless as well, perfectly willing to launch mass attack powers over populated areas, or use large summons to cause havoc and disperse his clones. No, this was going to take one heck of a plan, indeed. "Hey Gaara!" Naruto called out as he met his fellow demon container on the floor for their preliminary round against each other. "Before we start, I just want to make sure to tell you that whoever wins, I still want to stay friends." The demon vessel from Sand nodded gravely, although not saying much of anything. Ever since the two had met and had dinner together in the forest, they'd been inseparable. Gaara had done everything short of using his sand to carry Naruto around like a teddy bear since that day 1 week ago. Acting on a strange impulse, so glad to be having and using those again since the influx of more time had changed his situation around, Naruto decided that one extra cut short reset wouldn't hurt him, and decided to try out an experiment to test the other vessel's reactions. Gaara. This exam is important to me. Since I was a little child, my dream has always been to become Hokage, the leader of my village, and to do that I must advance through the ranks. Still, the job would be meaningless if I could not perform the duties, and a Hokage must treat this village as his precious people. A strong ninja will always put the needs of his precious people before his own, and your happiness is more important to me than this promotion. If you want, I will forfeit this fight so you can continue on to the real match. The demon container of sand stood motionless for precisely 4 heartbeats before turning to face the examiner, saying softly, "I concede." Naruto popped over across the floor to clasp the other demon container in a hug. "Thanks, Gaara." "Hey, does this mean I can date your sister?" "I'd have to two-time her, since I'm already officially dating Hinata, and maybe Tenten and Hana too. But would you be alright with that?" "Hey!" Kiba called from up in the stands, objecting to having his older sister involved in this strange and bizarre deal. Gaara paused, his brain short-circuiting as it discovered whole new paths he never explored before. The hug was certainly one. No one had ever hugged him before, not that he could recall. The other? "If you marry my sister, you would be my brother-in-law?" "Yup. That's the way it works." Naruto grinned widely. This felt so much better than almost blowing up Kiba with those explosive tags. Why hadn't he always done it this way? Joking was so much more fun than moping. Oh yeah, jokes had to be fresh, and freshness had been rather lacking in his life up until lately with that whole punch through to the extra month thing. "And as a family, would you spend more time with me?" Gaara whispered softly, although the whole room could still hear. "Uh-huh. That's the deal. Marry your sister, stick with you for life." Naruto shook his head in pretend grief. A giant hand of sand formed out of the ground and plucked Naruto up, holding him fast, but without crushing pressure. Temari shrieked when the same thing happened to her, and Kankuro almost reflexively began to pray for her poor soul. They'd always feared someday this would happen. Gaara had gone nuts and was carrying the two out the door? "Hey!" Kankuro looked over the railing to peer down. "Where are you going?" "To find a priest," Gaara answered insistently. "Naruto must become my brother at once. There can be no delays." "What?" Temari called out in shocked surprise, only to quiet down as Gaara shot a glare toward her. As her own eyes sought out Naruto, she gulped, yet resigned herself to it. This wasn't too bad, at least she got to live, and she liked what she'd seen of this kid from Konoha. They'd gotten along great together during the week they'd known each other. There were worse fates for a kunoichi than to have her husband chosen for her. I mean, that's what happened to the girls in infiltration all of the time. And those were the lucky ones. The unlucky ones, well, prostitutes heard way too much information from way too many sources not to have a few kunoichi inserted into those ranks, but that was pretty much the worst fate any aspiring ninja could ask for. Not only was the job horrible, degrading and disgusting, but between the diseases and risks of discovery, they tended not to live for very long. Compared to that, a ninja on an insertion mission was glad to marry a total stranger. Not only was she far more liable to live longer, but the duties were more pleasant, and there were plenty of cases of her learning to love the guy. Considered in that light, the Wind Mistress counted herself lucky, as this was a guy she already knew and tentatively liked. He seemed decent, and with the way Gaara was going on, she'd not even have to leave her hometown to do it. One of the big stresses of long-term insertion missions was leaving the environment you grew up in, most often for life, never to see any of your friends or family again. She shot a wan smile at her psychotic brother. "Okay. It's a little sudden, that's all. I was just hoping for more warning, but he seems like a great guy." Folding his arms to rest comfortably atop the fist of sand that held him aloft, Naruto pointed out before they'd left the door, "So long as we're doing this, you'll want to get the others too. Hinata is the kindest person you'll ever meet. You'll like her. And Tenten can be really fun to hang around." Temari developed a twitch in her left eye. Gaara paused on the threshold. "If they marry you, and you are my brother, then they become my sisters too?" "Yup. It works that way." Hands of sand grabbed the other two girls too. "Oi, Just so you know, Naruto said, kicking back comfortably in the fist of sand. Some of our priests might object to marrying me off to Hinata and Tenten too. Then I shall kill the ones who refuse until we find one who does not. Gaara stated flatly, once again heading for the door. Oi! Just so you know, Naruto said, kicking back comfortably in the fist of sand. Some of our priests might object to marrying me off to Hinata and Tenten too. Then I shall kill the ones who refuse until we find one who does not. Gaara stated flatly, once again heading for the door. No need! The Hokage called out before they'd left completely. No need to slaughter our priests. I agree with Naruto, most would resist, but you have no reason to go seeking them out. I can perform the ceremony here. I have that authority as a Hokage. He can marry us all at once, Tenten shouted out in disbelief. Hinata had fainted with a rosy blush, and a happy smile gracing her face, while Temari held a completely fake and plastic smile on hers, but knew better than to risk objecting, as disagreeing with Gaara was death. As the last member of his clan, and holder of significant personal property, he can do so, the Hokage agreed, before smiling softly. A law brought into place to protect advanced bloodlines, made more general on the objection of several significant, yet non-bloodline carrying, clans intending to preserve their techniques and rapidly rebuild in the face of catastrophe. Significant personal property? Doesn't he live in a slum? Ino asked from her place up on the balcony, observing all this transpire. Naruto has recently come to possess a much more significant estate. The Hokage demurely avoided mention of the Uchiha properties by name, since there were sure to be clans and members of the council who'd object. They couldn't do anything. Sarutobi had been fully within his rights to give them away, but the longer it took them to find out any specifics, the fewer noises they could make and the less headaches he would have over the issue. One moment, please. Naruto effortlessly escaped Gaara's sand coffin technique using a seal-less body switch with the stone lantern, and with his hands free formed a seal for his shadow clone technique. Alright, he pointed at his new army. You know what to do. Right. Several hundred Narutos pumped their fists in the air and instantly afterwards sprang apart to pursue those tasks. Half of them vanished in body flickers, transporting them all of the way across town to the former Uchiha compound, where they immediately began to work on clothes at a rushed pace. Others vanished into the forest surrounding Konoha, putting Ino's lessons on flowers to use. They sought out clusters of wild flowers he'd seen on his wanderings before and harvested them into tasteful, even artsy and extravagant wedding bouquets. Other clones began to cook up a storm, knowing that it wouldn't be ready in time for the ceremony itself, but hoping to catch the reception afterwards. Almost as soon as they were gone, clones began to reappear bearing small and simple items that made it clear what they were up to: a vase of flowers, a bridal veil to get tried on and adjusted, before getting taken back for more embroidery. Several clones bearing carpentry tools appeared to set up a stage and altar, going about their business with an appalling efficiency that clearly impressed Shino, the bug user, who was up on the stands. As first seconds, then minutes passed, the effects began to multiply and the chamber got transformed. Drapes of cloth hung from overhead, making the chamber festive. Candles glowed in crystal globes blown only moments before using handicraft jutsu Naruto had been inventing on his own. Stands of cut white marble appeared, and then a band arrived. Sooner than anyone present could believe possible, the gowns were being brought in, and the brides escorted out to change. That those tailors were also clones of the groom was not lost on anyone. With the suddenness of a rainstorm appearing out of the clear sky, the set had changed completely from a dreary, unadorned chamber to one of the most festive anyone had seen. There were filled punch bowls and candles, trays of light snacks, soft music being played, and the festive decorations went from rare and hard-to-find wildflower bouquets all of the way around to expertly cut crystal glass, and more seemed to be arriving every moment. Most of those present had gone into shock, although most of the women who hadn't were now completely googly-eyed. The brides appeared in a flurry of bridesmaids, who were also, coincidentally, all female Naruto clones, dressed in matching yet flattering dresses that supported beautifully arranged lace and ribbons, with limited embroidery, as there was little time and it was a time-consuming art, yet were tastefully downplayed just enough and served only to magnify the beauty of the brides who'd just been through spa treatments, a bit rushed it was true, and now glowed from within, filled through with inner feminine glory. Temari was beginning to enjoy herself. Marriage to a guy who could do all this. Oh yeah. Even if her brother hadn't insisted, she'd have been tempted, make that sorely tempted. Even if the guy was technically an enemy, with their Kazekage deciding to break their treaty and go to war. Ah man! How was she going to break that secret to her future husband? Life could be so unfair. She nearly dropped her wildflower bouquet when the Naruto who was with her whispered in her ear that he could guess what she was worried about, and not to worry, as he already knew about the planned invasion. Wow! Talk about marrying a ninja! Did he have effective skills or what? And wealthy from the looks of all of the stuff arriving. Also kind, couldn't forget that, not bad looking. Temari's fears and uncertainties began to settle as she realized without a doubt that she had just probably won the husband lottery on a blind choice. Tenten was lost in a womanly wonderland, having all of the glory of the finest wedding with none of the stress and hassles of preparing it. Naruto knew her tastes better than she did herself, and all of it was prepared to her liking. It all felt so wonderful she doubted any bit of it could be real. She had to be dreaming all of this. But if that was true, she didn't want to wake up. Hinata stood like a girl lost in wonder, standing alone in a snowstorm of lace and ribbons and silk floating down around her to arrange themselves about her body and the room. What had her attention fixed was the Naruto before her, standing there with a smile on his face, gently holding her hands so she did not faint once more. Others would talk of the beautiful ceremony, of the rapid pace of the arrival of the expensive decorations as if that was a miracle. There would be some comment on the food, the light snacks and such, or even the meal occurring afterward. But while she was present for all of that, and technically saw it all, the only thing Hinata would consciously remember was Naruto, standing there holding her hands with a gentle smile on his face and love for her, in his eyes. That alone made it the most beautiful and wonderful experience of her young life, a defining point that changed her very existence. Tenten Uzumaki, the girl, tried her new name out for size, trying it on for fit and flavor, and in the end deciding that she hadn't done so bad as far as married names go. And she'd scored a jackpot at the ceremony. She even got to help her sister brides open the wedding gifts. They had wedding gifts. How was that even possible? Not that she was complaining, as she liked it. She liked it very much. Hinata was lost in a haze. Tenten could have sworn they could have poured ice water over the girl and all it would have done is gotten the dress wet. She was so oblivious to everything going on around her that if her dress caught fire it could burn the entire gown, and she wouldn't notice her nudity, or the burned skin until the Naruto she was holding hands with and gazing into the eyes of let her go. Not, Tenten amended herself, as if that was a bad thing. The shy girl had definitely gotten the husband she'd always wanted, if her behavior was any indication. So deep was their rapport that it looked like they were communicating directly soul to soul. The weapons user turned away, blushing and more than a little envious. Shaking herself out of the envy over Hinata loving their husband more than she did, although she planned to, and expected she'd find it real easy, the girl turned her attention back to the ring on her finger. It was a simple gold band, plain and unadorned. The wonder of it was he'd been able to produce it at all, size for her finger no less. Although she herself was not aware of it, in future repeats of that scene she would be gazing down at steadily more complex and artistically beautiful pieces of jewelry, as the accumulated knowledge of all of the jewelers in Fire Country got added to a boy who was already their premier metallurgist, only to be used as a starting point for future experiments. Jewels appeared in increasingly complex cuts and varieties. Stones got tried that were larger or smaller, set in various ways intent on flattering each other. Loops of gold and silver etching made their appearances. Her dream ring appeared, and then became more than she'd ever dared, or even thought to dare, to dream of, until once again Tenten was staring at a simple ring, plain gold, and adorned only with silver inlaid runes etched delicately into its surface, resting upon her finger. That was a wonder all on its own, as the weapon's mistress concentrated a tiny bit of chakra into the seals etched into the ring, and it expanded into a gorgeous panoply of the jeweler's art, wirework and delicate tracery, and gems lovely beyond anything she could ever have imagined. It took her breath away, but was far too fancy to wear except for very special occasions. But that was all right, as with a tiny touch of her chakra the special parts once again sealed themselves in the storage runes carved in delicate tracery upon her wedding ring. It was perfect, even practical. She couldn't even begin to conceive of anything more. With a week of warning to prepare, future repeats of that wedding got far more intricate and dazzling than the original. All of what was there before got better, and with a dazzling degree of artistic sensibilities even more elements began to be added. Illusions of soft and misty waterfalls fell silently down the walls between the curtains. Rains of flower petals followed the brides, cascading across them, adding emphasis to their own ethereal beauty, yet vanishing the instant they touched the ground. Soap bubble cascades lifted in columns through the air, and to the soft music of the band got added an increasingly expert choir with several different voices of transformed Narutos, who sometimes sang so soft you were barely aware you were hearing them, and then other times raised their voices high in thundering carols rejoicing over the glory and beauty of the brides and the joy of that occasion until it seemed the very stones below the building shook with those hymns of praise. The food began to increase in volume and improve in quality, as Naruto did what he always did when he had a goal before him and devoured all of the cooking skill it was possible to acquire, out of any source whatsoever, then experimented until he could make an eater weep with joy. Desserts began to appear that stood as tall as Ino would if she were on the tables, and as beautifully decorated as any of the brides. They bore a decent resemblance to the blonde girl from Konoha as well, but then she'd been one of Naruto's more frequent artist models, so was a good base to work off of for making dancing nymphs cavorting about forests, and other such woodland scenes lovingly dressed out in cake and chocolates. Some of the ninja present decided to steal them to keep for themselves. And yes, Naruto began to work on scents and perfumes for the brides. He had girls to take care of now, and they needed their pretties. The boys spent more time perfecting 1,000 different recipes of scented bath soaps alone than he'd spent learning all of embroidery. Embroidery got added, other jewelry appeared, matching bracelets, necklaces and earrings, finally to include delicate jeweled tiaras and gem-studded belts, until the brides shone like glittering ice, always emphasizing, never detracting from or distracting from the beauty of those gorgeous girls. And they were gorgeous. Naruto had never yet abandoned an art halfway, and he went the whole beauty spa route until he could have made any girl seem like a princess in disguise, even while still wearing her usual clothes. Of course, to Naruto, his brides needed no such enhancement. They'd always been that beautiful to him. He was just helping others to see it. And the seals of storage on their wedding rings improved until all of their jewelry could be made to both appear and vanish into the ring at will. Then their dresses also, so they could return to their beautiful bridal gowns with but a thought. As the boy explored more into creating new seals to serve this useful and highly flattering function, he made it so those girls could change from their casual ninja attire to fully armored battle outfits, to their wedding dresses to ordinary day wear with just a thought and pulse of chakra through the ring. And the wardrobe capacity got expanded from there, to include modest swimsuits and other outfits they might need, as well. Ignorant that her future weddings would make nobility stew in envy, or not believe those rumors at all, and as things got steadily more fantastic, it was more of the latter and less of the former. Tenten tore her gaze from her wedding ring, and all it meant, to go mingle among her guests. It was a surprisingly dull crowd, most there being too stunned to find themselves at this occasion to be talking much, having been handed formal wear and shoved in closets only moments before. Her teacher, Guy, was there standing around and chatting in the amazingly well-cut tux and opera cape in which he'd given her away. In his new crew cut the man looked surprisingly normal, and as he caught her gaze he shot her a nice guy grin and thumbs up. Blushing, and not sure why, Tenten turned her attention away to go find some other part of the crowd. Gaara, as best man, had managed to avoid killing anyone. That was positive, although it didn't mean she wanted to go stand with him just now. There'd be plenty of time for that later, as she gathered he'd be over often. Lee was looking around for Sakura, while Niji had been drafted to hand out moist towelettes at the end of the buffet table, so her teammates would not be helpful. A conversation drew her over to one of the walls, where stood a life-size portrait of the wedding itself, showing an astonishing amount of detail from a very flattering perspective, in an excellent artistic arrangement. It was the perfect thing to remember this always. Two people were standing before the painting, discussing it, and as Tenten drew closer she could overhear his latest painting. "I love this artist's work. Did you know, in his earlier works he still emphasized drawing? You could pick out the outline and contrasts of tone and form." Drawing near enough to see over the shoulders of the crowd, Tenten blushed once again on realizing that she'd overheard two of her husband's clones discussing their own work, while a third one was still finishing it up. Almost laughing, Tenten turned herself around to finally see the looks of envy being shot at her by the other village girls and broke out in loud guffaws. Here she hadn't even known she'd had a boyfriend this morning, and she was being envied at her wedding. Oh! It was too rich. The girls standing there, all jealous, it was too funny. One of the Narutos arrived to guide the suddenly hilarious bride out to where she could recover her composure in private. She kept him so she could kiss him senseless. As, if her peers were going to get jealous over her catch, she was at least going to enjoy what she had. Sarutobi had stood watching those preparations appear as if by magic in an ever-increasing awe of his little friend's hidden talents. The shadow clone army that descended on the chamber, turning it from a plain room for holding battles into a festive one draped in a glorious display of cloth fabrics and wedding items, was a sight to behold. One of his own worst enemies was getting stuffed on cake and desserts and dancing with an old flame and having a wonderful time. Naruto had that effect on people sometimes. In all the history of Konoha, in all the ninja world that he was aware of, no one had ever used that technique quite like Naruto. For anyone else it was too costly to use in anything short of a desperate situation, for spying or for combat. But the multiplying force could be applied to labor as well, he just knew of no one aside from Naruto to ever do so. An army of carpenters, decorators, tailors and musicians indeed. Sarutobi knew of the ability to magnify one's learning through the use of clones. What was obvious to him was that Naruto had been using his unique ability to create hundreds, or possibly even thousands, of them to good effect. Possibly for some time. Sarutobi had not been watching. Nor had Kakashi, from the looks of it, although the legendary copycat had taken one of the larger cakes and escaped with it early on into the festivities. Obviously the orange-clad boy had been learning, and just as obviously, he was no imposter. It would be like lifting the Hokage monument to have anyone else try and duplicate the boy's unique ability to create so many hundreds of clones. He himself was Hokage, and wouldn't care to try. Nor had the Hokage missed the boy's pink-haired teammate flee out of the building, tears streaming down her face, and he believed he'd caught an anguished cry of, "It could have been me. That could have been me," before the door had completely closed behind her. Ah well. It was a strange, almost paradoxical, yet true proverb that you don't know what you've got till it's gone, that applied especially to young people and their romantic troubles. Not that the young had a monopoly on troubles. Sarutobi sighed. The life of a Hokage was filled with many painful necessities, although this latest one seemed especially poignant. He'd never had to send brides into combat while still wearing their wedding gowns before. But they now had several hours for the festivities, around a ceremony he'd initially suspected would take less than a minute, and he really couldn't delay the exams any further. So the old man clapped his gnarled hands once to bring himself attention, then again much louder to be heard over the dancing music played by the band. Finally he walked over to the conductor, another Naruto, somehow he was not surprised, and got him to silence the music. As the dancing ground to a reluctant halt, Sarutobi interjected in a loud voice. "I am sorry to interrupt this special occasion, but we came here originally for a quite different purpose. One I propose we get over with before you entirely dance the night away. Some of us, unfortunately, have to get up in the morning. Disturbing, I know. But if someone were to clear away that drape, I would like to restart the exam preliminaries, and I can't see the scoreboard to know who is to be fighting whom." Hate Gecko, who was the special in charge of this stage of the test, put down his dessert plate and wiped crumbs from his fingers, intending to go see to that himself, but a couple of Narutos got there ahead of him and began to lower those decorations out of the way. As the dance partners cleared the floor, people tried to recall where they'd been and what they'd been doing before the party started. Chunin and Hopeful standing around informal were began to feel around in their tuxedo pockets for the kunai they were sure they'd remembered to put in there, while the kunoichi earnestly wished for a few moments to change out of their ball gowns and back to more practical fighting attire. Kiba began to wish that he hadn't spiked the punch. To recap for those who might have forgotten, Sarutobi explained, to get things underway as soon as possible. We have had only one fight, that being between Gaara, of the Village of Sand, and Naruto of Konoha, and I must say that I have never seen a battle end so amicably before, none that even come close. However, sadly we must interrupt the joyous celebration to finish out the tests as required. Hate, if you would. Brushing the last few crumbs off of the front of his ruffled dress shirt, the special straightened the tails on his tux, coughed delicately into his hands to clear his throat, and called for the next match to be selected. The board began to flash through its supposedly random sequence. The brides returned a trifle late from side rooms, each guided by her own Naruto, one who often had incompletely wiped smudges of lipstick still visible, or staining his collar. Nor were they the only couples to return, so, several coming in a rush to get back before a match got decided that might get them to forfeit by non-attendance. Eyes drew wide and gasps of breath got drawn as the next match appeared. Eyes drew wide and gasps of breath got drawn as the next match appeared. Then the crowd burst out laughing uncontrollably. Confused, Sarutobi looked around to see what it was, and instead of what he'd intended to appear on the board, the next matchup was going to be between himself and a bunny rabbit, to see who became a. Odds were rather heavily favoring the bunny rabbit. Seeing Naruto's clones standing to either side of the scoreboard, grinning like loons, Sarutobi permitted himself to be amused. It was not subtle, but then he'd not been looking either, distracted by too many other events. Obviously, at some point Naruto had learned the minor lightning technique for altering the random setup. Interesting, although that opened up the possibility that the cheeky boy had chosen to fight against Gaara, as the Hokage himself had not selected that fight in any way, shape, or form. He had intended to put the Uchiha up against the chakra drainer, yet someone with subtle skills had overridden his chosen matchup. Come to think of it, it could not have been Naruto. Subtle had never been one of his traits, and Sarutobi had not been sufficiently distracted before the wedding celebration to have missed the boy's no doubt clumsy efforts to change the matchups to one of his own selection. So who was it? One of the, perhaps? Orochimaru, hidden among the crowd as the joint instructor of the sound team, who Naruto hadn't gotten around to killing in this reset, smiled softly. The orange-clad genin had frustrated his plans to test the Uchiha out in the Forest of Death by befriending Gaara and traveling with him, so to take out that frustration on him, by sending him to certain death in a fight against Gaara, had seemed to him only reasonable. Only the blonde-haired boy was proving to be a slippery one to get subtle revenge on, having not only gotten Gaara to concede, but getting the demon vessel from sand dancing with the pink-haired one and stuffing himself on desserts, and having a wonderful time. No, Orochimaru realized then that between Gaara's befriending the boy, and then Temari marrying him, the Sand siblings were now perhaps too close to the boy from Konoha to be relied upon to destroy his home. So it was time to go seek other options. The invasion could not be delayed, after all, and Konoha must be destroyed, in spite of how much he'd enjoyed those desserts, or the dancing with old acquaintances. They hadn't recognized him through his disguise, and the old boy had to admit he'd had a wonderful time himself. Perhaps, after destroying the village, he could kidnap the boy to get him to host his own future parties in sound? Orochimaru had to admit, he'd initially stared around the room, reptilian eyes wide. The blonde brat, who was becoming more interesting by the minute, had somehow managed to transform the main floor of the tower in the Forest of Death, which was about as dreary as they came, into this. Kukukuku, he chuckled in his thoughts. Perhaps, in addition to the Uchiha, I should take this other brat as well. Then he can do my nails, make me outfits, and make sure I look all around gorgeous. For Naruto, learning that lightning jutsu had been worth a minor makeout session with Anko. Obviously she knew the technique, since she was one of the head examiners and had probably done the whole process several times, taking the lead on different portions of the exam. So no. It had definitely been worth it to kiss her in exchange for the technique. Even if he'd had to kiss her a lot. Kakashi chose that moment to come back, slightly blimpy and with chocolate stains on his mask. He probably would have enjoyed that cake even more if the artwork hadn't been wearing a dress, but Naruto wasn't going to have nude art at a wedding, especially his own, and wouldn't have displayed in that way without her knowledge or permission in any case. Actually, probably not even then. The more he respected women and trusted them, the less he liked to see other people ogling them naked. It was like they were robbing the girls of something precious he couldn't quite describe. It occurred to him then that he hadn't used his sexy technique for a very long time, and it was a subconscious choice based on that reason. Then, like a bolt of lightning striking his brain, the boy recalled that using that was how he'd convinced the Toad Sannin to train him that first time, and his reluctance to use the technique since then had been one of the reasons he hadn't yet figured out a way to get the old pervert to train him again. Then the boy got stuck in a moral quandary around the question of, did he actually want the guy's training if it came at that price? Looking at his three brides, Hinata, Temari and Tenten, the boy decided that they were worth protecting. Very worth his protection. He'd never broken a promise yet, and part of those wedding vows had been very binding, very powerful promises to look out for, provide for, and protect those girls. So, yes, as the only person he'd be degrading by using that technique to scam some extra training, it was probably time to seek out the Toad guy. Who, he noted, was still stuffing himself at the buffet table, having arrived sometime during the party, drawn by the rumors of a multiple bride wedding, gotten stuffed on desserts and danced with old flames while having a wonderful time. Sasuke glared around, having to admit, if only to himself, that the dope threw a great party. The last Uchiha had stuffed himself with desserts, danced with a few fangirls, and had a wonderful time, even though he chose not to show it. Perhaps the dope wasn't completely useless after all? After Sasuke got his revenge on Itachi, he could use the dead last in hosting his future parties for him as he went in search of a suitable bride to help him rebuild his clan. Shikamaru had been dragged out to dance with Ino while Choji had stuffed himself on cake and desserts. But overall the team had to admit they'd had a wonderful time, even despite Shikamaru finding dancing troublesome and Ino wishing that she could have been one of the brides. Naruto must like her a lot if all of those cakes and things had been shaped like her, right? And those outfits. Any man who could hold a wedding like that on no notice had her interest, her very intense interest. But the clothes. She would have jumped him early on if she'd known he could sew like that. Only now he was taken, and very thoroughly taken at that, so oh well. She'd had to settle for scratching her "I am a female, give me romance" itch by dancing with her lazy teammate, who barely moved his feet. But for all that, it had been a great party overall. Ino decided she'd have to find out where the new couple? Quadruple? Whatever. Where they lived so she could stop by with a gift and maybe feel out how Naruto felt about catering and stuff for her future parties. And her marriage too, if she could ever find a suitable groom. Not a few of the kunoichi there had similar thoughts to Ino. There was nothing to get women worked up and excited over having more weddings like having been to a good one. It stirred something primal within them, and Konoha's couples would be plagued over the next month by ladies frustrated that the guys weren't playing along well enough with their let's get everybody married game. Nevertheless, a great deal of matchmaking went on that had nothing overt to do with the exam fights. Smiling, Sarutobi indicated to the Naruto clones they would not be getting away with such an easy trick again, and they cleared off, getting away from the sign. The Hokage stared across the floor at what he felt had to do with the real Naruto. Well, he had to be one of the ones standing with the brides anyway, thinking. It had been a part of his original plans to face off Tenten with Temari, but sending two brides to try and injure or even kill each other on their wedding day while still wearing their gowns seemed to be in incredibly poor taste, so he couldn't bear to do it, not only for those previous reasons, but he could tell that Naruto had figured out that the random selection board wasn't truly random at all. And he didn't want to damage his relationship with the boy over such a thing. Trouble was that left him juggling everything else at the last minute. Those two couldn't be made to face each other. But then who? Perhaps the easiest way would be to split up another of those planned fights so they'd unwittingly switch partners. Yes, that would be easiest. He even had a pairing in mind to use. The Haruno vs Yamanaka matchup could be split up and divided to give both new partners without disturbing his plans in the slightest. Triggering the random board once again, the gathered genin watched, rapt, as it decided some portion of their lives and futures. From the way Naruto's face turned white, he did not approve. The rest of the genin were not laughing, so this was not a prank on his part. But why should the boy be so distressed over the next fight? It was only going to be Sasuke against. Next match, Hinata Hyuga vs Yoroi Kato, Hate called out officially as head examiner. Sarutobi felt cold. That was not what he had intended. Not at all. But the old man could see clearly, Naruto was not behind this, but neither was he, so who else was manipulating the test fights? At least that explained the Gaara vs Naruto match. It hadn't been chosen by either of them either. Any of the other genin messing this up seemed unlikely, so that left the joining instructors as the next most likely possibility. The question now became, which one? The Hokage's senses began to probe the crowd. Naruto inhaled to shout, "Hey! There is no Hinata Hyuga anymore. She is my wife, and thus Hinata Uzumaki." The girl nearly fainted with joy over hearing that name. Overruled, Hate continued before the Hokage could stop him. She was under a different name when the system was programmed, that's all. It still means her. Exhaling a long breath, Naruto turned to whisper desperately to his beloved, "He is a chakra drainer. He can suck all of your energy out by touch. Your martial arts style depends upon forcing your energy into his coils to back them up and block them, but I don't think that will work on him. Do you have any other techniques besides the gentle fist style?" The Hinata of old would have shook her head in tender terror, unable to answer verbally for her fear. That fear was still there, but so much reduced it was like a different Hinata, one with confidence overlaid above her fear, that put her hand over his and said, "I'll be alright," and walked out onto the stage floor. Nonetheless, Naruto's insides were twisted with concern for her. Sarutobi was more than a bit upset himself. In the first place, because the Akato boy was among the weakest of those genin present, and he'd been hoping to save him for a fight against the Uchiha. In the second place, he was mad because the boy was known to be cruel, and the gentle Hyuga, or former Hyuga, girl was probably the one person present that the one-trick boy could beat. So not only would he be allowed to progress when it would be far better for Konoha if the boy remained behind, but he would be likely to do serious injury to the girl to no purpose, just to show he could. While Sarutobi had been willing to let the girl's cousin beat her, there was far more purpose to letting the branch house genius work out some frustrations than in this meaningless bout. Of the two now facing each other across the floor, Sarutobi would far rather the Hyuga heiress be the one to advance to the final test. She, at least, would have a far greater chance of presenting herself well, even if only in defeat. And between Naruto and her father stood a far greater chance of receiving training in the month between, while the other boy seemed to be dangerously confident in his abilities as they were. As pathetic as they were. No, this fight was a waste of everything involved, and the only thing it could do would be to destroy a bride's confidence on her wedding day to no point whatsoever. "Hinata, wait!" Naruto called out, rushing out on the stage floor to give his wife of only a few hours a kiss on her pale cheek. "For luck," he told her, before releasing her hands to retreat back to the side where everyone else waited. Sarutobi blinked. Had he just seen what he'd thought he'd seen? No, that was not possible. It would have taken a master of the arts. Unless Naruto? The Hokage settled in to watch this fight with more interest. "Begin!" the head examiner cried from his place beside the Hokage. Yoroi, the chakra-draining boy, stood gloating a few moments, waiting for the pale-haired heiress to make a move. The words he said were unimportant, but across from him Hinata was unmoved, only assuming a fighting stance. In the crowd, several eyes narrowed. Niji in particular noticed, but also Shino and Kiba, who'd been teammates with Hinata for months. In the end, Yoroi got tired of waiting for Hinata to make the first move and charged ahead, fists glowing with his absorptive aura. He swung several times and missed each one, as Hinata had elected to dodge rather than block. But soon enough it came about that the much larger genin got enough use out of his larger reach to plant a hit on the girl. She vanished instantly in a puff of smoke. It could have been a body flicker. There was no way to really prove that either way. But no. What had really happened was Naruto had switched out the real Hinata with one of his clones during their brief kiss. The clone, transformed to look like her, had put on as much delay as it could before being dispersed. However, that was enough, and the real Hinata made her appearance on the top of the giant stone statue in the room. And she was in full armor, Naruto having helped her into the set while the clone bought them time. The girl threw a handful of kunai. Her accuracy was regrettable, but that was still sufficient, as each of the 5 she'd thrown had each been bearing an active explosive tag. Then the kunoichi drew her sword. Injured, Kabuto's teammate came out of the smoke coughing and bearing significant damage from the explosions, only to find the previously shy girl was bearing down on him with the full knowledge that her beloved believed in her and wanted her to win. Her strike was clumsy, but it was enough. As 3 feet of steel sank into the boy's belly, quite by accident as Hinata hadn't been able to stop her rush in time, the girl surprised herself by blurting out half of Naruto's words as he'd handed her the blade. "Let's watch him drain this." "Drain this," she squeaked, a moment before she realized that sounded like trash talk. "Winner, Hinata Uzumaki," the head examiner called out calmly. And you know what? Hearing those words, that marvelous name applied to her made Hinata almost forget all about having another ninja struggling on the end of her sword. Medics came and pulled him off almost immediately, but Hinata could hardly even see them because all of the Narutos around her were cheering. Sakura forfeited her fight by not being present for it, sending Sasuke on to the finals without fighting. Another thing convincing Sarutobi that he was being outmatched at board manipulation, as he never have selected such a thing. Sending teammates to fight each other was needlessly destructive to the unity Konoha needed, even when said teammates were not present. And Naruto would also never have done such a thing. His look of horror as the match came up was proof the Hokage hadn't needed his innocence. Subtle signals had been passed around, until Sarutobi had checked with each of the Konoha present, and each had silently proclaimed their innocence through expressions. That left the playing field of who was tampering in this very thin. Almost a handful of foreign, though none in particular stood out. Then the third match to come up this evening chilled his blood. Next fight, Tenten vs Temari. The head examiner called out. The Hokage met Naruto's horrified gaze and subtly shook his head. He could see in the boy's eyes that his gramps were not behind this. The two brides were very unhappy to be facing each other, walking out with many backwards glances to their husband, until Naruto strode out himself, taking each one by the hand and facing the Hokage in between them. There was mischief in his eyes as the boy shouted, "Hey, Gramps! These fights are until only one side is able to continue, right?" The Hokage drew in a deep breath. "That is correct, Naruto, unfortunately. For what it is worth, I am truly sorry." The new husband took both of the girls around the waist and stood there with a huge, impish grin. "What are you talking about, Gramps? There is only one side here. A wife and her husband are one legal entity. Through me, each is united with the other, and there is only one side here. So we win." Though there were many holes that could be poked in the boy's reasoning, the Hokage chose not to, glad for the excuse. So instead he smiled. "You are correct in this instance, Naruto. Tenten, Temari, you both win, and both will advance." He turned to Hate, convincing him not to argue. "Go on with the next test." Not understanding the exception being made, but willing to go along with the spoken and unspoken orders in spite of that, the special nodded. Up on the balcony, Orochimaru was not smiling. Having rigged those tests, first for Gaara to fight that frustrating blonde, then intending to humiliate each of the boys' wives in turn and hopefully mar their collective wedding day with some tragedy, only to be frustrated, he was not amused. Still, he gathered his chakra, intending to cause another sort of tragedy. Instead of that, however, Naruto turned around and shouted to everyone, "Thank you all! There will now be a 5-minute recess for those of you who are inappropriately dressed for combat to change into more appropriate clothing and outfit yourselves with whatever weapons or equipment you may require. Please speak to one of the caterers if you have any special needs to be addressed. Once again, thank you all, and the dancing will resume in 25 minutes for those who have concluded their matches. In the meantime, drinks and the buffet are being moved outside for those not involved or who have already passed." Seeing Sarutobi endorse this, and calling for additional A&BU guards, the disguised snake decided enough was enough and left the premises under guise of going to the outdoor portion of the party. With the conclusion of at least their portion of the preliminary fights, Naruto realized that he backed himself into a corner. Despite his general unease over the subject of sex, there was no way he could keep himself out of the honeymoon festivities with a full month to go between the second and third exams. And, having passed the preliminaries, there was going to be no reset to save him from the consequences of joking with Gaara this time. Especially if if they were going to be sleeping together, as in spending the night in the same bed asleep, then there were certain secrets that he couldn't hide anymore. As in his foxy accessories. He'd gotten massive progress on his transformation skills. He could hold up a shape-shift all day without hardly thinking about it. But no sooner did he go to sleep than he sprouted ears and a bushy tail. Considering how heavily he slept, and how much he liked sleeping, there was no way he knew if to wake up before the girls did and slip out stealthily and silently before they noticed, even to just reapply the change. So that meant his immediate priority was to get them home to where he could break the news in relative quiet and isolation, and see how they'd react. "You certainly don't act like a groom about to start a honeymoon," Temari observed, choosing to tease him about his nervousness rather than to let it hurt her. Actually, she felt quite reassured by the boy's hesitance, as he'd seemed so much on top of everything else so far that she'd begun wondering what use she could be to him. Well, aside from as a sex object, that is. The girls had all been very impressed about the Uzumaki estate, formerly the Uchiha property. He'd had clones there since mid-afternoon, fixing it up for a residence for him and his brides, and the Uchihas had never had it so good, as all of those lessons learned on his apartment got put to use there, with his skills as a blacksmith and carpenter saving him from borrowing money to do it, too, as he could make nearly everything himself. Now they'd all gone quietly to separate rooms with their own grooms. Temari knew, objectively, that only one was the real Naruto. However, for the life of her, she couldn't figure out which without hitting one. And given that, she'd put some serious thought into what was the difference between him and his clones. She'd asked him about that, and found that they knew what he did and he knew what they did. They all had the same memories, experiences and skills, while reacting just as he did. So, really, all he'd been doing was being in more than one place at a time. And she could handle that. It was better than the alternative. 3 brides on 1 groom sounded awfully awkward to her, but this way he actually outnumbered them, rather than the other way around. And given how much ability he'd shown so far in pampering them, that was an equation she was happy, even enthusiastic to take. Weighed down by his own unhappiness, the boy turned to take her hands in his own and looked her seriously in the eyes. "Temari, darling, can I trust you?" The kunoichi sobered instantly, seriously considering his question. Among ninja, that was a very rare thing to ask. Trust was a heavy responsibility, and most were glad to avoid contact that close with their fellows, when their vows as ninja could cause them to break that at any time. As a result, they had very few of the really close friendships, preferring casual acquaintances. At least they did it that way in Sand, where the Kazekage could order an uncle to kill a nephew. She didn't know about Konoha, but assumed it to be the same. The girl swallowed her own nervous reaction. No one had ever asked that of her before. Being Gaara's sister, she'd been almost as lonely as her brother, and couldn't really trust him as he might kill her at any time. So this was a first. Then she thought about it. They were man and wife, and she found herself somewhat surprised over how much she'd been looking forward to exploring that relationship with him. Considering their makeouts earlier, and how those had affected her, she was quite interested to know what else he was a master of. Nervous, the kunoichi asked him a question herself: "Can I trust you?" He nodded without any hesitation, filling her with both relief and shame that she had ever doubted him. "With my life." "Okay." The kunoichi nervously tensed up. That was way more than she'd ever been expecting. What he just said amounted to, "Even if keeping your trust kills me, you can trust me." Not a halfway sentiment. Taking a deep breath, the new bride from Sand gave him a nod in return, and assumed as brave a smile as she could before saying, "Yes, you can trust me." She waited a moment, before impulsively adding, "with my life." He broke out into a relieved smile, but one that didn't wash away all of his tension just yet. What could be the cause of him being so nervous after what she just said? Temari wondered. Sure, Ninja had been known to break such oaths, or lie about them, but what caused him to doubt her trust? Before she could wonder more on what was wrong about her, Naruto gave her reassurance by blurting out the real issue. "I've got a problem," he told her. "A secret so big that, well, the village has always hated me for it." The girl from Sand curled an eyebrow, relieved and restored to most of her confidence now that she knew the issue wasn't some flaw he found with her. In a teasing tone of voice, she told him, "It's not much of a secret if your whole village knows enough to hate you for it. They know I'm a demon container, but that's only part of it. Your village hates Gaara because when he sleeps the demon comes out and rampages. I hold the Kyuubi, and my seal has always been much stronger, never letting the demon out, but before he got sealed into me, the Kyuubi ravaged much of Konoha, and they've never come close to forgiving me for that. They blame me for all of the damage, even though her being sealed into me was what stopped all of the losses from getting worse." Okay, Temari nodded, following him so far. It really wasn't too different from what Gaara had had to put up with, but that bit about his seal not having the same weakness as Gaara's was very reassuring. She'd been about ready to go screaming off into the night before he told her that. There just wasn't any way she was going to be sharing the same bed as a man whose demon came out to play every so often. But that wasn't the case here, so good. Temari felt there wasn't any secret so bad that he could reveal it now and still scare her. "So, if that's only part, what is the rest?" she prompted, when he paused. Looking up, he met her eyes again. "A long time ago, someone very precious to me got killed. I didn't have anyone else, really, and losing her hurt more than I can describe. I couldn't hurt that man who did it, so here he took a deep breath. I let the demon out. I got it back into its cage so fast no one even knows it was released, and the QB got so injured by that experience that it can't hurt anyone right now. It got so wounded it's been in a coma since then. I don't think, even if I let it out, it could hurt anyone right now. Temari actually grew more and more pleased as he told her this news. She frankly couldn't see a downside to any of this. So, what's the secret? The boy adopted a very self-deprecating grimace. While it was out, it did some decorating, as it liked to call it. And he released the shapeshift, popping out his foxy accessories. Temari stood for a moment blinking at those new additions. Below the level of her conscious awareness, a struggle took place between two very different reactions. One was shock, the other acceptance. The shock never stood a chance. For one, she was a ninja, and they had to deal with more insane conditions than some civilians could believe all of the time. Watching out for enemies hiding in shallow puddles or hanging off of walls was just part of the business. For another, they were cute and she was a girl, and girls go all about cute and fluffy animals. But underlying it all was the knowledge that a shocked reaction right now would be interpreted as rejection by the vulnerable youth before her, and that would damage their marriage. Gaara would literally kill her if she blew this marriage. So that was out. Responding almost at once, she gave him a big hug and laughed. "This is what you're all worked up about." She played with the tip of one ear, it twitched back out of her way, so she settled on stroking his tail. It was long and furry. She could just picture herself with this wrapped around her on cold nights. Naruto was stunned by her reaction. "You aren't mad?" "Mad? Why would I be mad?" The kunoichi touched one of those ears again, just to see it swivel out of the way again. The hair on it was really soft. I dunno. It's just the villagers have tried to mob me a few times over this." Temari snorted, as if to show her thoughts on that. "Well, then Konoha is stupid. They've forgotten what a real demon is. If you were anything to fear, they wouldn't dare mob you. And if you aren't, then they've no reason to." The boy stood there silently processing this new thought. Odd, it had never struck him that way before. "So," Temari asked him, stroking one ear just to see it react to her, "is this some kind of a bloodline? Are our kids going to look like this?" Naruto blinked, surprised again. "You know? I honestly have no idea." Chuckling, she led him off to their bedroom. "Well, then let's find out." Inwardly, she was aglow. He needed her. She'd already validated her place in this marriage, and they hadn't even taken off any of their clothes yet. In spite of being so incredible, he was hurt inside, and she could fix that. She was a success at her gender, and that alone made her bolder, knowing she had a place in this relationship, and therefore her world to come. "So, what's the secret?" Tenten asked him. "After all that build-up, it had better be a pretty good one." The boy adopted a very self-deprecating grimace. While it was out, it did some decorating, as it liked to call it. And he released the shapeshift, popping out his foxy accessories. Tenten had been feeling very insecure in her marriage. I mean, what did she offer to him? But now, seeing how terribly afraid he was over how she might react to this, she suddenly saw her place. "Wow!" She gave him a hug. "So these work?" She played with the tip of one ear. Twitching it reflexively out of the way of her seeking hand, he nodded. "Neat!" She called out, hugging him again. "So you have a bloodline. Why aren't you as popular as the Uchiha?" she asked him brightly. "Huh!" The boy blinked several times at her, not making the connection. The girl snuck close, trying on his tail as a feather boa around her neck. "Well, yeah? This is Konoha. We love our bloodlines. Why didn't you tell any of us you had one? This must be pretty rare. I've never heard of it before. Are you the last one to have it?" "Actually, I think I might be the first," he stumbled across his words, then scratched his head. "And I don't know if it's inheritable or not." "We should find out," she whispered sultrily in front of one of his triangle ears, causing the boy to blush down to his turtleneck, and making her giggle naughtily at his reaction. "No, really," she reassured him, still testing out and exploring the softness of his furry pieces. "Think about our history. Our clans are what made this town powerful, and you gotta admit, our town is in love with power. I mean, the Uchihas were able to come here because they'd been thrown out of their previous country for being disloyal thieves who robbed their own fellows of their priceless techniques. But they came here and we not only put up with them, we made them nobility. Similarly with the Hyugas, although they were seen as spies who couldn't stop peeping, we also made them nobles. Even our lesser clans are only less than that because their bloodlines or secret jutsu aren't as powerful. So, she teasingly wiped the tip of his tail across her face. What do these do? Naruto, too busy hugging her with tears in his eyes for this easy acceptance, took a moment to gather himself to answer her question. Oh? Well, the ears are really great at picking up far-off sounds accurately. I haven't found out a use for the tail yet. You'll want to start exploring that, the weapons mistress told her husband seriously. I mean, the ears are great. Hearing things far off puts us in the top tier of clans already. We'd be kinda on a level with the Inuzuka dog users if we'd worked out more ways to use this, though. Do you think you could learn to throw things with that tail? Or use a sword or something? No thumbs. No fingers either. He shrugged, weak from relief over her reaction. But you can wave it however you want? She asked again, only to be answered in giggles as the tip of his furriest appendage ticked her face. Capturing it for more petting, she told him, okay, that answers that one. You'll want to try to find a way to use that in combat now. We'll never be more than a great clan of scouts until we have our own fighting style, and a tail that can help, and that would be a big start. Do you know of any techniques you might be able to use with this? She buried her face in the furry appendage and wiggled it about. Naruto had been thinking, spurred on by her question, and had begun smiling in a wide and prankster way. Well, I do have lightning whips. If I could make one of those appear out of my tail, I could lash it about as a third weapon. You see? Tenten looked up at him lovingly, her face framed by his orange-red fur. A third weapon is exactly the sort of advantage that could be a good edge for us. Most ninja can only wield two, so their styles only allow for blocking or dealing with two in return. By being able to use three, we could take out many ninja who are more experienced than we are. A good set of senses and an edge at close fighting is all that's ever made the Hyuga great. Believe me, we don't love them for their personalities. Well, except for Hinata, but she's an exception, and acts nothing like the rest of those stuffed shirts. She rubbed her face in his fur again. I wish I could have a tail like this. It's soft, and so warm. Does this come with anything else? Responding to that question required no thought at all, as it had caused him near infinite embarrassment over having been thrown off all of his abilities. Yeah. It came with more strength, speed, and a humongous chakra boost. Tenten actually laughed. Don't sound so depressed about it, she told him brightly, actually enjoying herself and now certain of her utility in this match. That's actually a jackpot as far as bloodlines go. Strong and fast make up most of the difference between what ninja live or die. And chakra capacity is a big one, too. The more techniques you can throw, the more you matter and the bigger a difference you can make. Yeah, but it destroyed my chakra control utterly, the boy confessed to her, now finally relaxed enough to return the hug. Tenten stopped being playful for a moment. So you can't use techniques? Are you like Lee in that? The boy laughed into her shoulder. No. Well, at first I was, but that was only because I was throwing way too much chakra at everything. But I learned how to overcome that. And you remember how you overcame that? She asked him carefully. Yeah, he told her, suddenly worried now she seemed so concerned. To her this was important. So, she ventured, wanting to be absolutely sure of things. You could teach your children how to overcome that, if they have the same problem? Naruto gave that thought a moment, as he'd never considered it before. I think so, he ventured, still carefully considering. I've never taught all of what I know to anyone, but I remember all of the steps, and I've taught my techniques to people before, so it shouldn't be a problem. Instantly her joy came surging back and she redoubled the force of her hug. So I don't see what the problem is. You've got a couple of golden abilities that might be a bloodline set. I mean, think about it, what does a ninja do that can't be helped by more speed, strength, and chakra? If you can keep their extra capacity from ruining their control forever, our kids will be some of the greatest ninjas of Konoha. We've got some advantages similar to two of the best clans of our village. There are the extra senses and a fighting edge like the Hyuga, and some of the strength and toughness of the Inuzuka. The Kitsune clan will be one to be feared all across the elemental countries. I'm actually jealous, she told him, poking his chest and rubbing circles on it. Now I know my kids will be great, but I won't have the same advantages. Now Naruto was the one to be offering suggestions. Actually, he rubbed the back of his head as he admitted. We had a class on bloodline theft in my medical studies. He didn't mention that he'd been impersonating another student at the time. And they said that bloodlines can not only be traced and detected, if they are present, but most could even be stolen. It takes a better medic than I am to do it, but if they can be duplicated by theft, why not donation? I regenerate really fast, so none of the techniques they were discussing would be too dangerous for me. You even regenerate? She squealed in delight, wrapping herself around him excitedly. How much? The boy ninja hesitated, then decided to divulge the truth. A ninja stuck his arm through my chest once using an assassination technique. It blew a hole through my lung, but I got better. She froze in surprise, then carefully opened up his shirt. There's no scar, she said mildly, not sure whether to believe him or not. Oh, I never do. Here, let me demonstrate. Tenten's husband took a kunai out of a belt pouch and cut a short, thin line over his arm. It healed, literally, as she watched with stunned eyes. No scarring at all. She jumped him. After several moments of fantastic kissing, she told him as they came up for air, and did it never occur to you to wonder if that ability to regenerate might not be part of your bloodline, too? Think about it. The single worst fear of all parents of ninja is not seeing their kids again once they start going on missions. Strength and speed and chakra all help, but they don't stop anyone from being unlucky. A stray hit from out of nowhere has taken out some of the best ninja ever. So the ability to regenerate from wounds is a killer. No, that's not what I mean. I meant that they'll be coming back for more missions than anyone else might have hoped for. Our kids won't die as often as some others, which means we get to keep our family, even after they start becoming active-duty ninja. There came several more minutes of frantic and grateful kissing and snuggling. So, can you transform into animals, like a real fox? She teased him on their next trip up for air. I've never tried, he admitted, ashamed at not having explored that. Never thought of the stealth opportunities, huh? She toyed with his shirt, which she had never rebuttoned. Nope. Never had, he admitted, inwardly resolving to correct that. You and I, she told him, sitting up to help him finish taking off his shirt, are going to be exploring many things. Gazing down on his bare chest lovingly, she huskily gave him her final words for the evening. Starting with each other. So, what's the secret? Hinata asked her husband shyly. She'd not even given the briefest of hesitations over offering him her trust. The boy adopted a very self-deprecating grimace. While it was out, it did some decorating, as it liked to call it. And he released the shapeshift, popping out his foxy accessories. Hinata stood, absolutely frozen, for one moment before glomping onto him with all of the power her small body possessed, wrapping her entire collection of limbs tightly about him, while she pressed her face into that furry tail and shouted, "Take me now!" Jiraiya, Toad and Spy Master of Konoha hopped over the wall of the Uchiha estate that the kid had somehow acquired. The lights were on in parts of the main house, and the boy having just gotten married that day, there was sure to be some fascinating boinking going on. He could use that as material for his new book. Or at least, so he thought. However, he got surrounded by Naruto clones before he'd even gotten close to the main house. It hadn't even occurred to him to check for guards. Can we help you? One of the clones asked. Ha ha. I must have gotten lost, the Toad declared, wondering if they would really buy such a lame excuse. No, you didn't, one of the other clones corrected, before declaring, you came here for lecherous purposes, intending to act as a peeping Tom. So what if I did? The declared, striking a pose. For I am a super pervert, all of the clones echoed before he could go into his dance. You don't have to take all of my fun out of it, Jiraiya groused, upset at being thwarted in his introduction. Turning aside, he sighed, well, if you are going to be like that, I can go get my amusement elsewhere. The clones had started smirking. No, the one in the lead corrected. I think you are going to stick around and train us. Why should I? The shot back, more than a little peeved at their presumption. Because of this. The clones all formed hand seals. Sexy technique. The Toad Sanin's eyes shot out of their sockets and his jaw dropped open, drooling, as his tongue hung out. Yes. Yes. But only if you stay like that. The self-confessed super pervert drooled. Naruto was no longer scared of marriage. He liked this, and was planning on doing it often. Of course, in later repeats he resolved to do what he could do about getting Hana involved in all of this, because the only way he could find to make it all better was having the Inuzuka clan loyalty mixed into this. But the times he'd been engaged to her so far had actually been on those repeats, when he'd fought Kiba. This time it had been Gaara he'd faced during the prelims, and though Naruto had mentioned her during the initial setup, she hadn't been around the exam for Gaara to grab, and without the impetus of a sand coffin wedding it wasn't liable to happen this time around. And that was a shame because, as good as this was, he somehow felt that having Hana involved would make it all better. He'd have to try it and see. Because the only thing he could think of that could be better for spying than Hana's nose was Hinata's eyes, and since they both search for different things in different ways, the combination should be fantastic. After all, he'd learned enough of the Inuzuka clan techniques to use that nose, and had been quite impressed himself when he'd smelled something he couldn't identify, and Hana had sniffed for about a second before announcing that she smelled it too and that it was several miles away. Miles. As in walked for several hours to get their sort of range. The wind had shifted about to bring them a scent they never could have seen in person. Of course, the winds were unreliable, but it wasn't as if you'd learn nothing. Every breeze was a news article when you had that nose. And if he got Hana into his little family, they could use it without excuse, as she knew it legitimately, and could share it with him by clan rules, because it was shareable to spouses, and only spouses, but by those same rules he could also share it with Hinata and the others. Shouldn't be too hard to fix though. Arrange to give Hana the full spa and clothing fitting early on and she'd propose to him, ask her to come to the exams to cheer him on, and she would. The Inuzuka clan were loyal like that. Then Gaara could add her to the sand coffin wedding. Ah, and he mustn't forget to check her reaction to the foxy bits. She had a doggy inclination and those two breeds of canine didn't exactly get along. Probably best to spring the news after she'd agreed to marry him and begun to mark him as her own, so she had some investment in him, but while she was still high on the pleasure from the spa treatment, so she wasn't thinking too straight or clearly. He was worried about the fox thing, considering her dog's emphasis. But for the same reason he felt sure she'd have no qualms about the multiple bride thing, as dogs out in the wild formed pretty much exactly that arrangement. The alpha male got all of the breedable females that he wanted. And he'd have no problems being the alpha of his own little pack. Naruto's ability to plan things through had truly undergone a remarkable upswing as a result of all of these resets. He'd never have gotten anything done otherwise. Temari stirred in bed the next morning, wondering what is this incredible feeling. Then she saw a furry tail before her, tickling her nose as it twitched quietly in her husband's sleep, recalled everything, and pounced upon it, awakening him with a yelp while she cuddled her furry darling. Oh, and she'd deal with the husband it was attached to, as well. Tenten woke up wondering where she was and how she got there. This wasn't her apartment, and suddenly it all came flooding back to her, and she saw a pair of furry ears twitch towards her from atop the next pillow over. She grinned. Hinata was in heaven that morning. Naruto, already being the sum of all that was good or decent in her world, suddenly acquired a surge of unlooked-for cuteness that had been more than Hinata had been able to bear. She'd had to have him. There could have been no delays. But for once in her life, she got what she wanted, when she wanted it. Life didn't get any better than this. She hummed softly as she brushed her hair that morning, Naruto still softly snoring on the bed behind her. She knew he liked his sleep, but there were limits, and she'd have to be waking him up soon. Naruto's fox parts were, perhaps unsurprisingly, very sensitive. Still, as his brides gave him access to their sensitive parts, that in turn gave them the same access privileges to his. None of them were slow to take advantage of this. At breakfast, Hinata had jumped his tail and started petting it like her long-lost favorite teddy bear, which was odd, as she'd only just got done cuddling it the moment before. Still, that had been the bedroom Naruto, and this was the one making them all a hale and hearty breakfast, the tantalizing smells of which had finally drawn her downstairs. Good morning, darling, he greeted her with a kiss, as he'd read in the romance books that couples sometimes do. The girl practically melted. Luckily there were more clones, or breakfast might have gotten burned. Naruto was almost overwhelmed with new things to try. For once, he had more than he could easily do, and somehow felt the urge to hoard it all so he wouldn't run out soon. But he also felt a much greater desire to master those suggested new abilities as quickly as possible. Jiraiya had answered most of his questions on the subject of seals, and that had largely demystified the topic for him, breaking through to where he could start experimenting to learn more about their hows and whys. The books and stuff he'd studied so far had always been do this and do that, not the much more useful, this does this, and that does that opened the doors to true understanding and thus experimenting. Thousands of clones were all over the Uchiha estate that morning, blowing themselves up, warping space/time, getting themselves killed or shredded or blown into their constituent molecules by failed experiments, learning all that he could, applying those same means he'd used to master tailoring and the like, i.e., try all of the options to see what works best. Their casualty rates were appalling, of course, as failures in seal inscription were far less forgiving than in blacksmithy or leatherworking. Of course, there was far more to be practiced there than seals. Tenten had given him tons of new ideas, and he had to try them out. She'd been right about the fighting style. Adding a weapon jutsu to the tip of his tail so he could swing it about would be an extra nice advantage to have, so he had several clones out trying to adapt most of his techniques to that, and he wasn't just practicing the easy ones, either. He'd gotten some good results out of trying strange combinations before, so he was not only out there trying to get his lightning whips or fireballs to appear out of his tail, he had clones experimenting to see if he could slap the ground with his fuzzy end instead of his hands when he wanted to raise up an Earth-style wall. There were also clones practicing animal transformations. Shape-shifting into a fox went off surprisingly easy, no troubles there at all. So now he was working on other forms, and there he was running into some difficulties. As he was a human, so didn't have to think through their biologies, his own body already knew it. And he could do the fox form with ease, probably because of his connection through his little passenger, but he ran into a wall with birds and other animals as he didn't know their internal layouts very well, so couldn't duplicate that, and so couldn't change. Although he could almost do a dog, it seemed helping out in the Inuzuka clan clinic all those times had been more helpful than he thought. Initially he'd just done the clinic because he'd been bored, and it was there. Now he was very glad that he had. And enough of him caught rabbits as foxes that he got a really decent idea of their internal layout really quickly, so was able to start on that change as well. Actually, while he was thinking about it and had the contract, he did a quick toad, then made sure to do his best to memorize that form for later. Jiraiya had a short attention span at the best of times, ruled by his glands far more than by his head. To get information out of him was a delicate practice, and the most productive route to mining those veins of knowledge out of him was to tease him with seductive females to get his interest, then ask questions about the topic to get him back on track. It was a disgusting, degrading and humiliating practice that almost made Naruto wish that he didn't get those clones' memories. Baths were not sufficient to wash away the unclean feeling, even of just having the old lech look at her and want to paw her, but not actually getting to. The whole thing gave him a taste for what Kunoichi went through on infiltration assignments, and he made a vow right there that none of his girls would have to put up with that type of mission. Well, technically, he guessed one could say that Temari already was, but he then redoubled his initial promise to make certain she enjoyed it. However, in addition to demystifying seals, they had gotten the Toad to let them sign the Toad summoning contract again, without which Naruto had sadly been unable to summon any Toads in spite of several attempts. So that was looking good as far as the upcoming invasion went. With Gaara on his side, and the ability to summon a small gang of giant toads to deal with Orochimaru's giant summoned snakes, even if the snakes were able to beat the toads, it was a much more level playing field, into which could be thrown extra assistance as needed. Naruto was having fun planning this out. Between Gaara and the real him, plus the Hokage, they'd be able to beat Orochimaru when he went after the old guy. Using a few thousand of his clones to blunt the rest of the attacks from there would cost the enemy the advantage of surprise, and also reduce casualties by quite a bit. Then, if the toads could do no more than delay the giant snakes until they dealt with everything else, they could send more ninjas that way to tilt the balance back in favor of the toads. The blonde demon container grinned. It looked like he could save Konoha. Naruto was expecting to be doing the bloodline detection and determination thing on his own, and was already plotting how to sneak into areas where that data could be had, so he could learn those techniques to perform the entire thing himself, when one of his clones reported a small but significant party of individuals at the gates of the compound. Wondering why the Hokage would be visiting him with such a grim expression on his face, Naruto alerted everyone to let them know in time to get ready, and allowed those clones on guard to lead the visitors inside the compound. The Hokage was very unhappy, and considering his company, Naruto could easily see why. Hayashi Hyuga had never been on his list of friendly people, but after the boy had learned what he'd said and done to his tender daughter, it was doubtful that he was ever going to have a high opinion of the man. The other members of the town council were not happy people either. Not expecting any good news, he sent a clone off to fetch Gaara from where that demon vessel had spent the night. A quick couple of body flickers and an explanation later. Gaara, these guys just showed up at our house and look like they could be trying to break up our family. Brought an irate demon from Sand there in full battle attire, nor was he in a very good mood. Staring at the hair-trigger psychopath blocking their way into the main house, and the people they were there to speak to arrayed out behind, with clones dotting every rooftop around, the ninja in the Hokage's group realized they were in the beginnings of a battle situation and stopped where they were, spreading out a touch to get fighting room. Catching the first of the ANBU escort to run for cover in a sand coffin, Gaara squashed the man like a grape, spraying his blood all over the visiting party just to make his point before he growled in low tones, "You wanted something?" Seeing that dozens of Naruto clones had spread bags of sand all around the visiting party, none of the others made a rush to take cover. Hayashi Hyuga didn't care, striding boldly forward to the front of his group and declaring, "We are here for my daughter." The man's bloodline was activated. He was no fool, and was ready for combat to spring out from any direction. "I'm not going anywhere with you, father," Hinata declared out from behind the two Narutos she was concealing herself behind. "I command you to come to me," Hayashi barked out sharply, causing his daughter to flinch heavily at the heat of his angry words. One of the Narutos stepped forth and crossed its arms. "Command her as what? You are not Hokage, nor do you have a place in the command structure of ninja above her. You've got your own responsibilities, and they do not include either Hinata or me. As I am clan head, she must do as I wish." The man spat back angrily, enraged that he was being talked back to. Naruto was shaking his blonde head. "You're head of a clan she's not in. You might command her, if she was still a member of your clan. But she is not. Last night she stopped being a Hyuga and became an Uzumaki. This was even publicly acknowledged before hundreds of witnesses. You have no right to command her. As her father, I demand." "Shove it!" Naruto interrupted, uncrossing his arms. "You're no father to her. You're nothing but a bully and a blowhard. You happen to be married to her mother, but she got nothing from you. All of the things a girl is supposed to learn from a parent, she didn't get from you. You're no more her father than that rock over there. You're more of her landlord." And she moved out. Naruto stepped back and recrossed his arms. "Anyway, the rights of a husband trump those of a father, and I say that she doesn't have to go anywhere if she doesn't want to, but especially not with you." Actually, Naruto, Sarutobi sadly took his pipe out of his mouth, speaking for the first time on this visit. "As he and his advisors were so anxious to prove to me this morning, Hayashi governs a clan with a powerful bloodline. So he retains some rights to all of its bloodline-carrying members, in spite of marriage, according to the laws of Konoha." "But what if we had a bloodline?" Tenten blurted out. Then, seeing all of those hostile gazes on her, shrunk back. "She's right." Temari strode forward, and everyone noted she had her fan deployed and ready for action. "Naruto's got one of the most powerful bloodline abilities in Konoha. Surely that makes the US a bloodline-carrying clan, and gives us the same rights to our members. Since our clan rights would be equal if not superior to theirs, you couldn't do a thing to her." "The demon vessel has no bloodline," Hayashi snapped, signaling two of his branch house members forward to snag his daughter. Their bodies flickered over to grab her, but were caught instantly in sand and detained, then crushed, their remains spraying out over the visiting party. "There is no way I am going to allow anyone to put a curse seal on my sister to torture or kill her at their whims," Gaara growled out. "Let's put it this way," Naruto stamped, pointing a finger at the party of visiting dignitaries. "I am Naruto Uzumaki, living container for the nine-tailed demon fox. I have been to the representation of its cage inside my mind, and if any of you do anything at all to harm any member of my family. He paused to glare threateningly at them. I am ripping off that seal to let my prisoner out to play with you. He spoke in low and dangerous tones. Faces drained white among the entire crowd of dignitaries. The Hokage let his pipe fall to the ground unnoticed as his eyes bulged out, never having even imagined that Naruto would ever threaten such a thing, that he even could. Temari snorted at their shocked and goofy looks. Hey, it's your own fault. You treat him like a demon all of the time, but you've forgotten what real demons are. None of you wimps would ever dare to threaten him if he was the nine-tailed fox you all fear so. So get it through those little pinheads of yours, either he is the demon, or he isn't. If he is, fear him, but don't ever dare to provoke him. And if he isn't, then she shrugged casually. Beware lest you turn him into one. Spoken in the utter silence following Naruto's announcement, her words came through with a stunning clarity, as even among the ANBU some had wet themselves at the thought of facing the enormous demon fox again. After having such a trump card laid down upon their plans, the dignitaries began to reconsider many things, not the least of which was what they could get away with to continue on their current scheme, and of course some plans to destroy Naruto got hauled out of mothballs and revived. No, that threat didn't make him popular, but it did make them more wary. Stupidly wary, unfortunately, which meant they didn't truly believe his threat. Fully able to see this, Naruto released his shapeshift. Several veteran ninja of many years released their bowels on seeing his face beneath a set of furry ears, and with a foxy tail swinging out behind him. I think I should mention, the boy growled out almost casually, as he bared his still very human teeth at the visiting party. I've already got the demon to swear to destroy my enemies for me, and it gave me such nice gifts in return. Do you qualify? Are you my enemies? It is impossible to express in mere words the terror that gripped the hearts of most in Konoha over thoughts of the demon fox. It was a colossal force of nature as far as most were concerned, able to destroy anything, and only stopped by their last Hokage at great sacrifice to himself. A big part of the reason they loved him was for that sacrifice. Sarutobi had already begun to go through those seals in his mind, should it become necessary. He never would have imagined the boy could have gone from being so loyal to Konoha to threatening her now. But he was here, and that was what he'd done. But then the Hokage saw deeper, and relaxed inside. The boy was bluffing. It was a good bluff, even an excellent one, but it was still a bluff. He could tell, having known him for a very long time. These others. Sarutobi smirked inside and decided to play along. All right, Naruto. None of us desire for the demon to be released. What do you want? Naruto saw the Hokage's eyes, and caught on that the old man knew he was bluffing. On Naruto's part it wasn't much of a bluff, which was why he'd been able to scare the clan elders and town council so, in spite of so many of them being experienced ninja themselves. Naruto would be willing to release the demon fox to destroy them if they hurt any member of his family. The trouble there was, releasing the fox while it was weakened so much it was in a coma wouldn't do him any good. One of Hana's puppies could beat it up in the condition it was in now. So it was a bluff, but only the old man had seen through it, fortunately. Nothing much, the boy answered back, dropping his angry pose to let his furry tail swish out behind him. Just leave me and my family alone, confirm our bloodline and give us the same status as the rest of the powerful clans. Nothing we aren't already entitled to, really. Sarutobi was nodding, pretending to be grave, but he wasn't. Inside, he was celebrating. He never wanted to disturb the young newlyweds on the first full day of their marriage. Not only was it rude, and in incredibly poor taste, but exercising authority solely for the purpose of hurting others had been the poison that destroyed Orochimaru, turning him from a loyal ninja into a missing one, an enemy to Konoha. Yet that same poison existed in Hayashi and others within Konoha as well. Having been an unwilling partner to this parade of authority, brought here to put a caged bird seal on a newlywed girl, Sarutobi was more than willing to see the purpose of this expedition fail. He might have had to object or quibble, even call the boy's bluff, if he tried to ask too much, but especially after the disgusting display put on by Hayashi in his office, he was more than willing to go along and see the angry Hyuga put in his place. And it would protect the young man from all sorts of repercussions as well, to have his own status as head of a bloodline-carrying clan. Sarutobi even sent for a team of medics whose leader he knew could fudge those results for him. But to the Hokage's amazed surprise, such subterfuge proved entirely unnecessary. The team of medics called during the aftermath to resolve this standoff did their diagnostics, and Sarutobi noted how intently Naruto was watching them work, and confirmed, without any instruction from him, the presence of not only a bloodline, but an advanced one. Regeneration, extra strength, speed, and a massive chakra boost were all a part of it. They even confirmed that extra appendages of Naruto's were included, something that caught Sarutobi even more by surprise, as he'd expected those to have been something the boy used a transformation to achieve in order to strengthen his bluff. But no, the whiskers, ears and tail were strong genetic traits and potentially inheritable according to the medical ninja. Quite extraordinary. Resolving to have a private talk with the boy later, after some suitable interval so as not to disturb their honeymoon further, Sarutobi smirked at Hayashi as they made their exit from the Uzumaki estate, and asked, "So, how does it feel to have the boy achieve equal status with you? As one bloodline-carrying clan heads to another?" The look on Hayashi's face was enough to set the Hokage laughing all of the way back to his office. Jiraiya and Orochimaru faced each other across the flaming ruins of Konoha. Both proud men assumed attack stances, before Jiraiya declared, "The cheese is old and moldy." Orochimaru gave a long lick up the blade of his sword into a pig. "Head I must stick." The two of them glared at each other a moment before shaking themselves and declaring in unison, "Bad Japanese," and going off to kill the author. And you see, that's the sort of situation we are avoiding by not using any Oriental phrases I can't possibly do without. The scenery in Naruto's mind was an adequate reflection of his situation. When he'd first been there, it had resembled a sewer, dull and featureless and completely miserable, which had been a sad but telling representation of his life back then, underneath the cheerful facade. And who was Kakashi to talk about seeing underneath yet being unable to peer through even so flimsy a mask? Anyway, not long after he'd learned to use the resets to his advantage, things had begun to change in the landscape of his mind. Books had begun to appear in bookcases along the walls of the drier portions as he'd begun to read, and more of them as he'd learned to love it. The water drained out as his hopelessness retreated, and more features began to show up as he learned and gained new skills. There was a concert hall in there now, with plush seats and gold-plated art and everything. He had a woodworking shop with a vast array of tools out of his experience reworking his apartment. Still, it did not come close to being as extensive a workroom as existed for his more developed craft skills for working with cloth, metal and leather. A small jewelry counter with fine tools had appeared after he had done his wives' rings, and that promised to be expanded soon. The kitchen, once nice, now promised to be both expanded and upgraded also, as did the chemistry lab for mixing dyes, where a new section had been added that so far was just a bare floor with a scents and perfumes to be added here sign upon it. There was a small hospital within his mind, armed with a vast array of charts and some few medical devices, most of which did not work very well. But the anatomy models of 30 or so women lined the walls. Art, however, filled the place like a warehouse. Countless drawings and not a few paintings almost covered the walls. Artists' renditions, some crude and clumsy, others masterfully done, with everything in between, covered all of the available wall surfaces down there. And around them the halls had begun to morph until the place more closely resembled a fine mansion instead of a sewer. Windows had even begun to appear, showing forth green and cheerful forested hills beyond, representing future possibilities to come. It was, however, to the dojo where his steps now took him. That place had come into being to represent his ninja techniques and abilities. At first, it resembled the sewer so closely one could not tell the difference between them, all dull and featureless and hopeless, even with a banner hung limply from one wall, labeled Shadow Clone. His one significant ninja achievement. Now the place was bigger, and countless throwing weapons hung from hooks upon the walls, ready to be taken down and used. To the one banner on the wall had been added many, one for every technique he'd mastered, and some of those banners were more fancy than others. As they had gone from "I barely know this" on up to mastery, they went from cheap and wrinkled gray-brown paper with dull black lettering and somewhat tatty, on up to some of his best examples, which were his basic 3 ninja techniques, that were expensive cloth of vivid scarlet with gold lettering, and exquisitely cared for. Body flicker was as impressive as they, and others were advancing. His sexy technique, along with his shape-shift power, made that an even 6 in gold and scarlet, but his mind's dojo was beginning to be festooned with festive blues and yellows representing less ridiculously perfected techniques. On one end also stood a trophy case. There had been one award, previous to his entry into these resets, and that had been his initial fight with Zabuza. Now there were many other victories symbolized and remembered therein. Still, the dummy that stood in the corner, a statue of him, wore only a yellow belt, not very high up in Konoha's ranking scale at all, a symbol of his lack in martial arts compared to his other abilities. But that was okay, the place had come a long way in a short time and was due for more improvements yet. The boy rolled over in his sleep and continued resting. After the visit by the Hokage and the town dignitaries, there was no end of excited discussion in the upper circles of the village leaders, and this quickly spread down the ranks until even the lowest members had heard of the news. Naruto had threatened to turn the demon fox loose on them. It had already agreed to destroy his enemies. Countless people who had felt no fear at all bullying a small boy with no one to protect him wept like little children themselves over the recent threat to their own existence. On the other hand, news got out that the boy had a bloodline. Tenten's prediction came true more quickly than she would have imagined, as the clerk in the registry office dealing with the major clans and their abilities gave them the designation the Kitsune clan on their official registration of Konoha's members with advanced bloodlines. The man did it more than partly out of bitterness. Naruto would adopt it as his moniker of choice, wiping out the little fan signs that were all over his new house and property, to replace them with a fox head on a spiral background. The other clans were not amused. Naruto had, by then, completely dismantled the Uchiha properties one by one on previous resets, so he knew about all there was to know of their secrets. He'd found the secret purpose of the Sharingan beneath the clan shrine, and was not all that impressed by it. It was along the lines of spread misery, pain, and death. Really, what would you expect of a bloodline whose highest powers could only be activated by killing your best friend? They'd created it to seek a better yogurt recipe? They wouldn't have had to keep such a purpose secret. But he hadn't found the clan library, only proof that there was one. But even knowing it was there somewhere, he couldn't find it, which, having dismantled every building on the grounds, led him to be terribly impressed by the stealth under which they'd hidden it. There were, however, tucked in odd corners, forgotten behind bookshelves, fallen under beds, hidden inside of drawers and just part of the general mess, a few scrolls here or there that he'd discovered on techniques. About 30 or so, again, and not in any particular order or grouping. A substantial few of these were on the clan's martial arts style, showing him more than Sasuke's scrolls had, although still very much incomplete. The style was clearly superior to the one taught in the academy, but what could you expect from a clan whose ability was to memorize anything they could see? By just keeping hold of the good bits, even a dunce could establish something, and the ninja of the Uchiha clan had all had the academy training to start with, so it would have been simple to build up from there. However, there were enough blank spots, skipped portions, and incomplete knowledge of it revealed in general on that scattered collection of scrolls that Naruto did not know how to learn it just yet, although he could get started practicing on what those scrolls did show. Most of the other scrolls covered ninja techniques that he already knew. The paralysis one, and body flicker were among them, also most of his fire stuff he found other copies of. But there were two new ones he never heard of before, as well as 4 illusions. One of the two was a wind technique that Naruto was quite glad for, as previously his only techniques for wind had been that sound amplifier he'd used as a microphone without speakers to carry his voice over wide areas, a gusty barricade for stopping thrown weapons, not that people used many of those on him, or at least they hadn't yet, and 2 attack forms. The big and clumsy slashing tornado he'd once used for cutting apart Manda, the giant snake, but was too unwieldy for most purposes, and a pressure bullet that shot out a ball of air for attacking over long distances. Those were nice, but it wasn't a wide selection. He had almost twice that number of earth and water techniques. Although the scrolls he got from Sasuke's apartment had numbered 30, an average 6 per element, it had been an average, not an exact distribution, and he'd been a little short on the wind and lightning departments, while being strong on earth and water, as far as numbers of techniques per element. This new one, Breakthrough, was a welcome addition to an element he'd been previously short on, although it was more of that breathe it out through your mouth school of ninjutsu that it was difficult if not impossible to use wearing a full-face helmet with a breath mask attached. Actually, looking over that scroll, Naruto considered something. This looked, in most ways, very similar to something Orochimaru did when he wanted to destroy wide areas. They both released blasts of wind in a long cone to cause massive destruction, although the Snake Freak's version was clearly bigger and more powerful than this one was intended to be. They were probably related, though, like the Fireball and Great Fireball Jutsu, where one was just a bigger, more impressive version of the other. Temari would know. Actually, Naruto got a gleeful grin. Now wasn't exactly the time, but soon he could ask Temari all about her techniques. As a wind specialist, she had an impressive arsenal of one element he was currently short on. Yes, learning some of that could be very nice indeed. Hayashi was not a man used to dealing with equals. He'd had so few of them during his lifetime. The Uchiha clan head, back when there had been one, had not been an equal so much as a rival to be surpassed and overcome, although Hayashi knew in the minds of others the Hyugas were a distant second to the glory of the Uchiha. The other clans did not stand on equal footing with him, all being less than he was. Even his twin brother, having received a cursed seal on his forehead and not gotten the same quality of training, had not been an equal. Hayashi's life had been unequally divided between superiors and inferiors. Those who were inferior, which was most of them, had to be properly subservient, or else risk being punished. While those who were superior, which was a small list mostly reserved for the Hokage and Uchiha clan head, could be worked around and circumvented if one wanted badly enough. Acknowledging anyone as separate and equal chaffed, and went contrary to his upbringing. Those who were strong ruled. It was the natural order of things and the reason he'd always been so harsh on his failure of a daughter. She was not strong, therefore she was not fit to rule. An accident of birth had made her a clan heiress, but he had been working to fix that and replace her with her much more powerful younger sister, Hanabi. The town of Konoha was abuzz with news. There was a new bloodline-carrying clan in town. That was always good news and cause for celebration. What the bloodline was caused mixed feelings, to say the least. Particularly since the boy who carried it had always evoked strong negative reactions. To those who had no personal experience with the Kyuubi's attack, it was a cause for confusion over the rest of Konoha's reaction. But not having been there, they could not understand, even if it got described to them, which it couldn't because of the Hokage's law against telling anyone. The mixed reaction was turning bad, however, and it didn't have far to go before it got very bad indeed. So, standing in his office, looking out over the village he had served for so many years, Sarutobi decided to do something that for many reasons he had felt was impossible for a great many years to come. Those reasons he had not shared before now were good ones, very strong and compelling ones, absolutely crucial to the boy's safety. But if the village was going to react as strongly as they might against him, those previous reasons became meaningless. Yes, they had disliked Naruto Uzumaki before now, even been mildly cruel to him, and so many had been only mildly cruel that it had all added up to a very cruel life indeed for the boy, but no one single action was responsible. The Hokage had always believed that Naruto's actions could eventually win the town of his birth over. However, if they came to see his bloodline as the Kyuubi reborn in flesh, that would not happen. Some impressions, once they are made, are irreversible. And if they truly decided he was an enemy, they would make him into one, despite all of the boy's loyalty before this. Sarutobi sighed. If only the office of Hokage was actually as powerful as everyone seemed to think it was. He had a powerful hand in issuing orders, but the execution of those orders was always up to those who ought to obey them. Sometimes their own feelings overrode his wishes, and they twisted or ignored or neglected his orders to follow their own feelings. Even when that meant the social torture of a blameless boy, who also happened to be the only son of a hero they lovingly revered. Without Naruto's help, the demon fox could not have been sealed, and it would have destroyed Konoha utterly and completely in its fury. Without a child to seal the demon into, the fourth Hokage would have been helpless to stop the creature's rampages. And being the kind, brave, and generous man that he was, the fourth had chosen to use his only son as the demon's containment vessel, believing that no other family should be made to sacrifice for his own plans, and asking only that his child be viewed as a hero for the sacrifice he was making. A wish that had been utterly, totally, and completely ignored, when it was not actively stomped upon, spat upon, or worse, by the very village he had saved. No, the citizens of Konoha had never been rational when it came to the fox, and once they decided Naruto was the fox reborn, nothing would turn them from that, and they would either drive him out or kill him, or force him to release that demon upon them once again. They had always suspected him before, but with the new bloodline abilities registered it would go from a suspicion to fact in their minds. They would care nothing for his orders to protect or support the child then. They paid little enough attention to them now. No, Sarutobi decided. It would turn a portion of the village against him in either case, but it was time to reveal certain information before the rumors grew out of hand. He would tell them of his successor's sacrifice in greater detail than they had heard before, and who Naruto really was, and coach it all in terms of the fourth's victory over the Kyuubi, granting his line powers that he had stolen from the demon fox. It would mean that many of the fourth Hokage's very deadly enemies would seek the boy out and try to kill him, but better he be in danger from without than within, and Konoha was on the verge of driving that boy out forever. And that was if they didn't succeed in killing him. Or if he didn't actually release the demon upon them for trying. No, they had to be told, or else they'd destroy any possibility of keeping the fourth's legacy loyal to Konoha, if there was even a Konoha left after he was done with it. Sarutobi sent out Anbu to call the town together, close the shops and businesses to get everyone possible gathered together. He had a speech to give, and he'd give it to them exactly how he thought it out in his mind. He would reveal that Naruto was the only child of the fourth Hokage, and the reasons why that had to be concealed for so very long. He would tell them again that the boy was a hero, and if they failed to listen to him after that, then Konoha was ruined. Whether or not it survived, if they could reject him then, it was no longer the town that Sarutobi had cherished for most of his life. And he would tell them that too. Because if they couldn't believe him, then he was passing off this hat to whoever wanted it, to take his family, and leave the village of his birth forever. And he would encourage Naruto and his new family to come with him. The shocked look on Naruto's face made the Hokage feel ill. As he'd made the announcement, he'd expected some reaction, even prepared for many of those by preceding Anbu here or there to whisper the right thing at the right time for him. He had not prepared for how the look on Naruto's face stung him. It was as though he'd let the child starve, then told him there'd been a feast laid in the kitchen all along. The "why did you let me suffer like that" face of trust suddenly challenged by disbelief, that by retaining this information, he had actually helped to author some of the child's suffering. Sarutobi had never thought of it that way. He'd reasoned it all out before the child was a week old and never felt the need to challenge those assumptions since. It had been for the boy's own good. It had kept him safe. But he could see in Naruto's eyes that the boy disagreed, that he had felt neither good nor safe. To the Hokage, the minor cruelties heaped upon the boy all of his life long were just that, minor. But he had never stopped to consider what it must have felt like to the boy at the center of them, when they made up his entire existence, and he did not have a whole lifetime of good experiences behind him to offset them and grant perspective. It was not a small portion of his life, as it had been for the Hokage. It had been the whole thing, and it wasn't coming at the end of a long life full of accomplishments, either. No, it had all taken place when the boy was growing and developing, going through the process of discovering who he was when he was more vulnerable than at any other period of his life. A development that Sarutobi realized at last had been stunted by the cruel barbs he himself had dismissed as inconsequential. To Naruto, however, they'd been of great consequence. Sarutobi could see clearly in his face the boy would have far rather lived with the deadly peril, and been loved, than to have grown up as he did, safe yet hated. And in that perhaps he was correct, as the Uchiha also had many enemies, both in and out of Konoha, yet there had been few if any attempts on Sasuke's life. The town's opinions were thrown in turmoil again, now knowing that the child they had always hated was the only son of their most beloved hero, and just as much responsible for the sealing of the tailed beast as the dead hero they adored. But the Hokage had underestimated just how much they'd hated the boy, and also how deeply rooted that had gotten, because not even this revelation made their opinions swing back to where he felt they ought to be, liking and respecting the boy at last. No, what they got was more turmoil. It made Sarutobi feel old. And he feared he might have to start planning that move. That situation was not resolved one way or another before the attack came on the day of the finals, as usual. Naruto thought they'd been ready. He planned, but things did not go the way he would have wished for them to. That day began with several thousand of his clones seated out across the village, ready to spring out and counter enemy ninja, and that was the only reason he knew anything about that day at all. The real Naruto had been taken out in the first moments, before any warning had arrived. Orochimaru, knowing that Gaara, after having befriended Naruto, was not liable to help him destroy the village, had had a whole month to go seek other options, and knowing Gaara was liable to join in the defense of Konoha, he'd brought not one extra sidekick along, but several. It started when they were all waiting for Sasuke, as usual. Many of Naruto's brides had lost their fights and that had much of his attention captured, but then the walls inside the waiting area had exploded and he knew no more. His clones, seated around that area as well as other battle sites, had seen enough to piece together what happened later. Some freaky bone guy with a sound headband had broken into the waiting room where contestants stayed between their fights, and he'd taken down Naruto so fast it wasn't even funny, departing with a shot back to the other genin, something about how his master wanted the blonde brat for his parties and so he was going to get the blonde brat for his parties. Bullets and javelins of bone had slaughtered some of the other hopefuls, but they were still trying to muster a group to follow after the ninja in his escape when a woman in her early 20s just walked right out of the wall, grabbed Hinata around the throat, and phased back out through the stone. The trouble was, that woman was wearing a headband from the hidden village of Cloud, not Sand or Sound. After that it would have been reasonable to assume that a large party of Cloud Ninja would join with the attackers from the other two villages, but aside from that one woman, whom he'd say was none of his clones had reported seeing any other Cloud headbands among the invasion army. Nor were those the only shocks. There were several others. Hinata was gone before anyone realized that the bone-using guy had slapped Gaara with a forced sleep illusion, putting Gaara under and allowing the personality of the one-tailed demon raccoon to take over. That had been a mess, to say the least, as no one had even realized what was wrong before the monster was already forming out of sand, and they'd been forced to flee, fight or die. Although, for those genin, fighting and dying were almost the same thing against Gaara's demonic body. The extent of this catastrophe had been small enough to escape notice from the stands, so the audience was largely unaware of them until they'd all gone beyond easy fixing, and by then they'd had their own problems. Naruto had been through this battle enough times to know that a big cause for the massive casualties had been someone putting the entire stadium to sleep, where they could be killed like sitting ducks. So, not knowing who or how, Naruto had seeded that area and its environs with clones to spy out whoever did it, and how it was done. He'd spotted an ANBU in the back of the crowd pulling off the technique. This time through he'd placed his clones so they were able to catch him, however. It was Kabuto. They'd only fought for a few moments before he'd lost his mask, and it was the ninja who'd always been so friendly during the early steps of the exam, standing there wearing a sound headband. The shock was enough that his clones stopped fighting and Kabuto destroyed all of the ones around him, before making good on his escape. That had only been the beginning of this catastrophe, however. Apparently deciding that he could not count on Gaara not to be woken before he went all on everyone, Orochimaru had brought in more. From different parts of the village lightning gathered together to form the six-tailed demon tiger, and various other elements combined to form the eight-tailed demon dragon. The Konoha left behind by these three terrible beasts was not even fit to call a crater. Having been blasted so many times it was more of a dip in the ground without even so much as a recognizable burn or impact shape. The shinobi from Sand and Sound had to do nothing more than prevent Konoha ninja from escaping. One last clone survived that destruction, having followed after the bone guy in the shape-shifted form of a normal red fox, catching up to him after the other pursuing clones had been destroyed, and when the guy apparently thought he was free and clear. Or perhaps it was that he'd been paying more attention to the two guys in black towels who'd stopped him, the overstuffed bathrobe sort of look that made you doubt the guy in it was wearing any underpants, or pants. That clone had survived long enough to hear the name, Itachi, before one of the towel guys noticed their eavesdropper and pierced him with a senbon, or something. In truth the clone didn't even know what hit it. Orochimaru was amused, not just a little amused but very, as virtually all of his long-term plans had come to fruition in one day, and it was now setting on towards night. Really, how could it get any better than this? By promising to restore Tsunade's boyfriend and brother to life, he'd gotten her to heal Kimimaro Kagaya, who was among his most useful servants. With his assistance and power, it had been child's play to arrange a number of other helpful incidents and additions to his plans. Orochimaru, having been in the criminal organization Akatsuki, who sought the tailed demons to use their power, had a fair idea of where some of them were, so went and got them. And he'd use 2 demons because he was certain one would be opposing him. Simple battle by numbers meant always making sure they're on your side, or at least not against it. As far as sealing or unsealing those beasts went, he didn't bother. The great 5 ninja villages had each tried creating their own, but many of the minor villages had experimented with that as well, hoping that by doing so they could become major villages. However, due to the many drawbacks of the results, not many had kept those vessels around. He already knew of at least 3, possibly 4, demon vessels who were outcast, abandoned by their villages, simply ripe for the taking. Since Akatsuki was not going to be active on the demon capturing phase of their plan for many years yet, that meant they were still wandering around unclaimed. So Orochimaru claimed them. When his first idea to use a vessel didn't work, he merely went out and got others, then modified their seals to have the same weaknesses as Gaara's. Child's play, really? He wondered why he hadn't gone and done it before. Oh yes. The Kazekage of Sand had caught wind of some of his plans and was about to warn Konoha, so he'd had to kill him. Then, having done it, it had seemed so artful to turn one ally against the other. So instead of facing 2 villages allied against him, through one assassination and impersonation he could turn one against the other to aid in his own plans. It had been artful, really. But not as satisfying as what he'd just accomplished. That blonde boy had forced him to modify his plans until really the end result had been better than his plans before it. He really ought to thank that child for inspiring him to new heights when it came to his plan to destroy Konoha, as the end result had been a thing of art, truly a form of poetry in destruction. Not only had he destroyed his former teacher, and the village that had once rejected his rights to do with their citizens as he pleased, but he tweaked the nose of his former criminal comrades while doing it. One of the problems with the Akatsuki organization was they had to do things in a certain order. He was not so bound. They had to steal and seal all of the tailed beasts in order from least to greatest, and so they wouldn't dare to move before they had found them all, lest they tip off others to their plans and create resistance. An enemy, knowing they needed those demons for their plots, might destroy one of the containers, slaying the beast inside, just to frustrate them, as Akatsuki needed all of those beasts in order to carry out their grand plan. So, they could not act until they were fully prepared to move quickly and decisively, carrying out their plan completely before anyone could react to try and stalemate them. Thus, until they were fully prepared to collect them all, with everything ready to do so, they dare not capture any. It was one of the many reasons he'd left the organization. They had no flexibility or imagination. And they couldn't begin the demon capturing stage of their plan at once anyway, as they had other stages they intended to go through first, namely accumulating the wealth required to construct a mercenary army, and then constructing it, before they even began to hunt for demon containers. So he'd gone and borrowed a couple of those demon containers they'd found out about, but hadn't yet made any moves against. If they died during that battle, that was nothing to him, except that it would amuse him to no end to see the Akatsuki frustrated like that. They had such small minds, really. He'd gone and achieved 2 of their goals without them, creating his own hidden village, more loyal and cheaper than an army of mercenaries, and thus a more than an adequate substitute, and by doing so already got wealthy. He could achieve the power they desired simply by destroying the other ninja villages, one by one, in strikes like this one, and the irony was many of the survivors would come flocking to him as missing ninja. It would amuse him to frustrate more of Akatsuki's plans in the future, but for now taking their precious demon containers under his wing and sending them out in active combat where they might die amused him enough. Of course, playing in their sandbox, this blatantly guaranteed his former criminal friends would come after him in return, which ordinarily he would not have risked, as it would have cost him too much time away from his other projects dealing with them. But with Kimimaro fully healed by Tsunade, well, he had less cause to fear those visits. Significantly less cause. Akatsuki, who had agents watching those demon vessels, had caught him going to interact with their prey, so followed along to see what he was doing. But Itachi and his partner had run away rather than face him and Kimimaro together, when he'd caught them interrupting his agent's escape with that lovely blonde-haired party thrower. Cloud had also sensed something, as he'd spotted an agent or 2 of theirs about. They'd most likely been tipped off when he'd begun gathering demon containers for his service, just like Akatsuki had. But they had not interfered with his plans, most likely just there to see if they could gain any advantage out of the destruction of their old enemy. No, life really didn't get any better than this. Orochimaru was ignorant of it as the reset occurred, shifting things back to their starting point and erasing all of the Snake Sanin's hard-won progress and satisfaction, putting him back near the beginning of his plans. Naruto didn't know about anyone else, but after a month-long honeymoon that ended with his bride's friends, village, and everybody else he knew or even cared about being abducted and or killed, he thought he was going to need a day or two to recuperate before heading off to do the whole month all over again. Still, some questions were just going to bug him until he got answers for them, so he might as well start out early, so long as he pursued it in a low-stress kind of way. He'd long ago been able to create a Nin-info card without any of the items or persons he was seeking present, just using images pulled out of his mind, and he'd developed an exceptional memory. So, that morning, on his way to the written part of the test, he made one for that Cloud Ninja chick, patterned after the ones the spy used, and when Kabuto came over to talk to them, he, after restraining the urge to strangle the traitor, bent over to pick up a dropped card and showed it to Kabuto, asking him, "Who is this?" Seeing as how he was part of that invasion, he might just know. Kabuto accepted the card from him in some surprise. "Wow! I didn't even know I had a card on this lady. In fact, I'm sure I didn't. Where did you get this?" Naruto just gave him a childish and helpless, "I don't know" sort of shrug and gestured to where he'd bent over toward the floor. "Who is it?" Ino asked. "Bless her heart." Kabuto straightened up his glasses and looked more closely at the card. It was disturbingly like his own, even patterned with the same back. He could have sworn he hadn't been foolish enough to carry any of these kinds of cards to the test, where he wouldn't need them. And he really didn't think he had, as this one was missing most of the data he had on his card for her. Seeing the eyes of the genin on him, Kabuto had to be mindful of his disguise of a friendly, helpful, older student and smiled. "Well, this belongs more in a bingo book than a card collection like mine. This lady is Yujito Ni, her rank is probably. She's a cloud ninja who has sometimes been called the living ghost. Rumor has it she can walk through walls, breathe fire, and a host of other things. Luckily we won't be having to deal with anyone like her on this test, or I'd flunk my 7th time for sure." And with that, the special infiltration agent put the card away, giving it a place among his own until he could analyze it to learn where it came from. He wouldn't pay very much attention to the stray dogs fighting over garbage that would witness where he was going as he left for that day, nor the fox hiding under some bushes by a rabbit hole on the next, or the rabbit chewing on grass further along on his path the day after that. No, he wouldn't notice those at all. But they would notice him, and note where he was going. Yes, they would note that very carefully indeed. Kabuto had just become a man to watch. Listening in on Kabuto's conversation with Orochimaru as the two traitors talked was enlightening. Very enlightening indeed. Naruto had known the ears were useful, as they proved that by themselves more or less right out of the box. On Tenten's advice he'd begun to test out the tail, and to his surprise it looked very much like that was going to be an effective tool in his arsenal from then on. While he could not yet use any of his techniques with it, indications were pretty clear he soon would, as he was almost there with some of them already. That left him to consider the last of his foxy accessories, the oft-forgotten whiskers. When they'd been nothing more than lines on his face, that's all they'd been, lines on his face. He might have put them there with makeup for all of the difference they made. Now that they stuck out like hairs, though, things were entirely different. Much like he'd worked hard at ignoring the sensations caused by his tail, the boy had actively shut out what he'd been feeling out of those whisker hairs. But now that he was paying attention to them, he realized they were yet another information-gathering device. He could sense breezes no one else would notice. That was the first one, but far from the last. His ability to sense air movements through them was so acute that he could tell when bodies around him were in motion, whether or not he could hear or see them. As he began to explore this, he discovered that ability could be used as a sort of danger sense. Objects in motion around him could be sensed as they shifted the air. Fast movements made pressure waves completely different than slow ones did, and after some practice he began to be able to tell, just by feeling with his whiskers, what was moving and where. So, when something began to come at him quickly, the pressure waves it created still got there first, regardless of how fast it was, and by being able to detect those pressure waves, he could often react to something before it arrived. Even the air displaced by ninja techniques like body switch or flicker made distinctive impressions that he began to learn how to detect and react to before the ninja had fully arrived. Potentially deadly useful as a ninja technique, although like all of the rest his ability to use it properly would have to be developed. Another thing the medics had proclaimed him as having was excellent night vision. Naruto had never given it any thought. How he saw at night was simply how he saw at night. It had never occurred to him to wonder if that was better or worse than anyone else's. But Tenten had gone all over how useful that was to ninja, and how much it would benefit her progeny, and how well suited it was especially in combination with their fantastic ears, making them even better scouts. It had hurt a surprising amount to lose her. Even though he could get her back, he wasn't eager to do it only to lose her again. That hurt. Naruto had been busy adapting the Inuzuka clan flash suppressor technique from their nose to his ears, as, since they became a clan that became a known issue, there would be ninja out there intending to take advantage of his keen hearing to use that against him. Although one thing he had not expected was how much more easily he could find his girls during their month of wedded bliss after that first morning. At first he couldn't understand it, he just knew where they were without looking, just knowing. He was beginning to think he had some kind of psychic mate sense or whatever you want to call it, until Gaara stroked his tail, looking a lot like a toddler that had just discovered stuffed animals, and all of a sudden he could find him, too. And now, after the reset, he couldn't find any of them. After some study in the library on the subject of foxes, he was able to find out why. It was his tail. He had a scent gland in the tip, and whatever touch that he could find so easily he wasn't even aware how he'd been doing it. So he had an ability to mark stuff if he wanted to find them later. That could be useful. Hey Sasuke. The blonde genin walked up to his teammate and slapped him on the back, before whispering in his ear loud enough for all to hear, I was just wondering, why does your hair look like a duck's butt? The last Uchiha growled and threw a fist at him. Naruto, who'd read about that move now, not only blocked it but spun the other boy about until he had him pinned on the floor underneath him. The orange-clad genin peered more closely into his teammate's hair, before jumping back and declaring, I knew it. You are a natural pinkhead. You just dye it. EWWW. The blonde boy squirmed in disgust. That means Sakura is only after you to fill all of her sick, incestuous fantasies. The room full of hopefuls broke out laughing. Sakura was mortified. Sasuke was disgusted by his teammate acting like this, and, as he picked himself up off of the floor, opted to ignore him. Naruto was grinning both outside and in. He'd been using a simple disguise technique instead of his full shape shift to hide his foxy bits, and now having slapped the guy with his tail as well as his hand to disguise that contact, he could experiment with how far a range he could detect someone over, and how long a scent marking lasted, gathering useful information on the limits of his new ability, while practicing with all of the rest of them, too. As he watched his teammates sulk, and pretend not to have been humiliated before the other hopefuls waiting to take the written test, Naruto began recalling to mind something that the Hokage had told him a few times he'd been in there to get the Uchiha property. Sasuke had been subjected to torture by his brother for several days using a special illusion. The special part of that to Naruto was the illusion. He'd asked about this in more detail the few times he'd dared, and all the Hokage would say was that it was a special, secret technique that trapped a victim inside their mind for 3 days while the one who cast it tortured them. Well, Naruto had no interest in torturing anyone. Well, except maybe Sasuke, but the broody brat deserved it. On that point, at least, he could agree with Itachi. But anyway, the real value of this, to him, lay in that special illusion. What if you didn't want to torture anyone? What if you just wanted to spend time with them? And if you really could capture someone in an illusion that lasts only a second or so, but you get 3 days with them, he could be training them. There were tons of things he'd like to teach Tenten and Hinata before they began the second stage of the exam. Obviously, he didn't have the time during real time. But if he could be training them up on some of those abilities, they'd have much easier tests not only during the prelims, but during the finals too. This idea kicked learning new illusions up a notch on his personal priority list. And the best teacher for that was Kurenai. After a failed appeal to his teacher of choice, Naruto had shape-shifted into a pile of paperwork and had one of his shadow clones, shape-shifted into the form of one of the Hokage's clerks, carry him into the office to set him on the Hokage's desk before Kurenai got there, as he'd wanted to know why she went to the Hokage's office after refusing to train him. And Hinata's teacher entered with a full head of steam, getting right to the point the moment she arrived. Hokage, you've got to let me teach him. Naruto's basic clone is picture perfect, you could shave by it. He uses no hand seals to call it forth, and it arrives without hardly a trace. Even a skilled ninja could easily miss its arrival if they weren't careful. His transformation is almost as good, and his veil isn't the usual one. It has fewer limits of size and space and a much greater operator range. The kid is a natural illusion genius. I can't think of how he got so good with all of the lousy teaching he's had. Plus, I've seen him using Nininfo cards that other Genin Kabuto is flashing around, the ones based on our secret markers. But Naruto makes his own. Those are another form of C-rank illusion, one programmed and imprinted on a solid object to be activated by chakra. We have who call themselves illusion specialists who don't have Naruto's facility for this art. Sarutobi was nodding, sucking on his pipe with a big smile. I'm glad to hear it. But, as you know, that decision ultimately resides with Kakashi, as his joint instructor, and so far he's refused, saying it will disrupt his own plans for Naruto's development. Kurenai leaned over, placing her hands on the Hokage's desk. Kakashi has no plans for Naruto's development. He plans to keep him back so he can treat his favorite to the ability to taunt his rival for being useless. The Hokage instantly went from a kind old man to a stern taskmaster. That is enough. Kurenai, when I trusted Kakashi to be Naruto's instructor, it was with the utmost faith in his ability. And I do not suspect his having entered Naruto into the exams, over his academy instructor's protests, was an attempt to hold him back. Hinata's teacher stood back, humbly. One did not argue with the Hokage lightly, and she'd overstepped some bounds. I'm sorry for my presumption. Good day, Hokage-sama. She bowed her head and turned to leave. Well, Naruto had gotten an earful of interesting information. With a deliberate BMPH, Naruto was suddenly sitting on the Hokage's desk in his usual form. Actually, I've also got a variant of the transformation that, according to Ebisu, ought to be an S-rank technique. It's an actual, physical change instead of an illusion. The Hokage, his two ANBU guards, and Kurenai all stood staring at him slack-jawed. He might have to do this again. Reaching over, he tweaked the Hokage's nose. And Gramps, if you think Kakashi cares about anyone but the Uchiha, you're sorely mistaken. If he could have left me out of the exams and still entered his prodigy, he would have. He's never given me any training of any kind. I've had to work on my own for everything I've learned. So whatever schedule he says you might be interrupting is hogwash. Sarutobi was sputtering. Naruto! Enough! As your instructor, Kakashi has my full faith and trust. The boy leaned over and stared at the old man nose to nose. Gramps, if you trust him, then I can no longer trust you. Which will it be? The scene was silent for several moments, before Sarutobi sighed. Has he really been that cruel to you, Naruto? In a word? Yes. The boy stood there, proudly folding his arms. I'd have done better on any other team. If his words had been a whip lashing him, Sarutobi would hardly have acted any differently. But Naruto, if things are that bad, why didn't you say anything? Naruto went nose to nose with the Hokage and told him flatly, he's had your full faith and trust. I told you, old man, and you didn't believe me. I was in here complaining and you dismissed me. I had to wait until there was another job and saying the exact same thing and then show you skills you hadn't known I'd learned, because Kakashi cares nothing for my instruction and so didn't bother to report to you because he'd never seen it, before you'd believe me. That answer seemed to deflate the Hokage, filling him up with sadness. He was a student of your father's. I had hoped. The old man gave it up and sighed. I'm sorry, Naruto. Truly sorry indeed. Sorry, don't get me any training, the demon container interrupted. I've had to lie, cheat, and steal to get my ninja abilities. And while it's done wonders for my stealth skills, I shouldn't have had to treat my instructor as an enemy combatant to restrict my growth by any means possible. Yes, of course. Kurenai, you may teach him what you will. The old man waved a gnarled old hand tiredly, seeming very frail at that moment. Naruto, the old man's voice came to them as Hinata's teacher was opening the door for them both. It should not need to be said, but just so you know for certain, you have heard it from my own mouth. Kakashi is no longer the instructor of Team 7. His status as an instructor of any sort will be put on probation, pending a full investigation of his actions. Deliberately sabotaging one's own students' welfare is an inexcusable charge, and he will pay the penalty, I assure you. Naruto nodded firmly and left with Kurenai. After the demon container and his new teacher were gone, Sarutobi mustered enough of himself to chuckle dryly to his guards. And now I shall never again be able to entirely free myself of the suspicion that my paperwork is spying on me. Kurenai was a dream teacher in many ways. She knew exactly how to coach what she was saying in terms her students could understand. She was also fair. Since Naruto would be learning illusions under her, she called her whole team together to let them sit in on those lessons, so no one was left out. Illusions being her peculiar area of specialty, she knew a lot to pass on, too. For Naruto this was bliss, as she knew a great deal of why things worked with illusions and was able to pass that on to him in ways that demystified the whole art for him, not enough to free him up to experiment, as it was all the hows and whys of how to use them properly, because she didn't feel ready yet to tell them the nuts and bolts of how they really worked. But it did help him substantially in perfecting and tweaking all of the illusions he knew. She would have gone faster, but was keeping it to a pace at which her team could follow, although the joining positively glowed when he caught on at once and started to ask insightful questions. Hey, you study about an art for years, even if only peripherally, and you learn what to ask when you start learning the topic itself. And Naruto had always had an amazing gift at learning. That was when he was actually being taught something, rather than put off, ignored, or sabotaged. No, he was making Kurenai a very happy teacher indeed. Of course, that was not all that was going on. Naruto had a team of clones strip mining the Uchiha estate, blasting the topsoil off to expose the bedrock underneath, looking for signs of concealed construction even on that. Hey, that Uchiha library had to be somewhere, right? And if it wasn't in a building, it was probably buried. Somehow he doubted they'd be trusting enough to place it on someone else's property. He also had clones out mastering the wind techniques Temari had shown him, as well as others practicing everything else he still had on the development list, like all of his chakra control exercises and perfecting the last little touches on his basic techniques, while practicing his other skills. Among those other techniques were a whole new slew of chakra control exercises he devised through Tenten's suggestion about using his tail in battle, because if he could channel chakra through his tail to create jutsu, why not explore using it through other areas of his body? He'd fought Niji more than once in the finals, and he'd listened to that heavenly spin technique of his described more than once. It required the boy to emit chakra from all over his body as one of the steps to executing it. So, that was something Naruto began to try. He might or might not be able to use the actual technique, probably not, as everyone kept saying it needed the Hyuga bloodline to use properly, and Kakashi not having copied it seemed to bear that out. But still, every other time he'd learned to manipulate his chakra in new ways, one of the payoffs from that had been more control. Nor was he sticking to just that. The very idea of using chakra through other places on your body threw off all sorts of limits on his progress. He'd been taught to float a leaf above his forehead. Now he had clones out there practicing that, with the leaves floating above his hands, shoulders, feet, elbows, nose, tongue, ears, armpits, back, whiskers, tail, and so on. The same thing with the tree climbing thing. Instead of sticking to a vertical surface using his feet alone, he was now trying to use other areas of his body, so he could sit on the side of a wall, cling to it with the backs of his arms, palms, knees, tail, the top of his head, and so on. Any part of his body was fair game for this, and by branching out like this he was learning lots and accelerating the pace of his improvement. Already his chakra control was back to where Ebisu would have called it tolerable, above average, but barely, which, of course, was making it easier to learn illusions. And what was better yet, he still hadn't topped out on what this new type of exercise could teach him. He was still expanding his control from there. Experimenting with those seals was still consuming an awful lot of clones. Actually, one happy incident about the whole seal experiment thing was that his limiters had improved to the point where he could, between them and his newly improved base of chakra control, pass himself off as having perfect control, if only barely, and only when he was concentrating real hard on it. But that still opened up whole new avenues to pursue his medical studies. Now he could pretend to be one of those rare people with perfect control, so could qualify for the really intensive and valuable classes, learning the highest grades of medical skills that were also the most valuable. And over the past few resets since the wedding and before getting Kurenai as a teacher, he'd been doing exactly that, getting his clones to take over for him during not only the written but the forest tests so he could use that time himself, spending it at the hospital getting his medical skills up. and they had been shooting up nicely, too. After only one day under Kurenai already, Naruto was looking forward to more of the same from her. He was just walking along toward home for more training, having had clones deliver meals out to where Kurenai was teaching them to maximize that opportunity so she wouldn't call it for meals, yet still having exhausted what she was willing to teach for the day, when he caught Sakura coming up to him in a fine head of steam. "Naruto! Where have you been? Kakashi called us together, but you didn't show up. I've been out looking for you for hours. You shouldn't waste a lady's time like that." He batted away her hand where she tried to grab him to haul along behind her like a disobedient child. "Haruno, there is a code of conduct a girl has to live up to before she can be called a lady. You don't, therefore you aren't." Her anger quickly turned to shock, then confusion. Since when has he ever stood up to her, or talked back to her, before? Hey! That was insulting. Since when was she not a lady? She ought to smack him, for then her mind kicked in and analyzed that statement. Her mom had said much on the topic of ladylike behavior, and she hadn't been. How'd Naruto known she hadn't been living up to that? Who'd told him about that code anyway? Where had he heard of it? Sakura's mind grasped for any excuse it could to avoid coming to face that he was right on the button about her behavior, that it was as far from ladylike as it was possible to get and not be a gorilla. There were other ways of breaking that code, it was true, other extreme paths she might have followed. But between her shouting and rudeness to him in general, not to mention her violence, those parts she was breaking almost as thoroughly as one can. The girl filled with shame and cringed back and caught expression on her face. Still, the crisis got taken out of her hands as Kakashi showed up. "Naruto! You did not arrive when I called the team together." "That's because you don't have any authority to call our team together. You aren't on it. You are no longer our instructor anymore. I heard it from the Hokage's own mouth, you don't teach anyone anymore. You are on probation for having majorly screwed up with us." Kakashi looked at him, and what parts of his face could be seen filled with both sadness and disappointment. "So it was you who turned you in?" "Yeah. It was me." "What of it?" Naruto sent a challenge right back. "What was it you've always said, those who abandon their team are worse than garbage? Well, that's what you are. You could only hope that someday you might rise as high as only being garbage." Sakura flinched back from this exchange. "Say, why were you ever given a team anyway?" Naruto asked his teacher. "I am the perfect teacher for Sasuke," Kakashi stated boldly. "Really?" Naruto leaned in close to stare in the Jonin's exposed eye. "Here I thought you had 3 students." Turning away to walk home, Naruto noticed they had drawn something of a crowd. Kurenai had taught her lessons at one of the training grounds, and it had just been easier to cross the academy from where he'd been on his route to where he was going. Since classes had just gotten out, there were dozens of ninja listening to this exchange. So he turned right back to face Kakashi. "Oh, by the way, the Hokage let slip this morning that you were a student of my father's." Kakashi's eyes went wide, in a slightly panicked way. "Now I may not have known who my father was," Naruto lied expertly. "That secret was always kept from me. But it was real easy to look up who your one and only teacher was, the 4th Hokage." Gasps were heard from the assembled ninja. Sakura's jaw dropped wide open. Naruto stood there boldly, placing his hands on his hips to declare, "From that start it was easy to confirm, I am the son of the 4th Hokage." He shouted out in a loud voice that covered the entire schoolyard, whereupon hundreds more came by to listen, shock and disbelief in many of their eyes. "But you sacrificed me, sabotaging my progress, letting no other teacher train me while you deliberately held me back," he told Kakashi at the top of his lungs. "And you didn't even do it to make your own favorite student better. That much could have been served by making us both compete for abilities. No! Instead you chose to do it just to stroke his already bloated, ugly pride. You did it to make him feel superior." Kakashi's eye was now widened into an caught expression. Naruto crowded into the Jonin's personal space, yet continued shouting. "Now I don't know what punishment a teacher gets for betraying his students. But this much I will tell you, whatever bonds of honor, love or loyalty you owe my family, you have broken. Whatever debts you owed to your teacher you have failed to repay, and not just failed, but utterly turned your back upon. You have spat upon honor. You have turned aside from duty. You have shat upon trust. And whatever oaths you owed to my father, the fourth Hokage, you have betrayed. Turning his back upon the Naruto called back over his shoulder. Your own father was called on to commit suicide over a dishonor less than yours. But you haven't even got the sense to feel shame over it. Kakashi, by your behavior you define worthless. All of Konoha is soiled by having you as a member of it. Sakura practically fainted over this storm of fury directed to her teacher. And with that, Naruto stormed out of the courtyard, leaving the assembled ninja stunned, stumped and flabbergasted to start rumors behind him. For once, they would even be in his favor. Is it true, Sarutobi? Is the demon child the son of the fourth? A council member seriously asked while that body was in session, only waiting for him to deny it so they could drop severe punishment on the boy for claiming it. Sarutobi could sense that, and was inwardly cursing his loose mouth. Naruto truly was a genius ninja, both to have penetrated his office and to have made so much out of a careless slip of his tongue. Also, he'd grown up an orphan, so it was hardly surprising that he'd brag about his family the moment he knew of it. Yes, it is true. He sighed, taking out his pipe and blowing a plume of smoke before continuing. Erasure decided to use his own son as the vessel, viewing it as his family's responsibility to contain the beast and save Konoha. It was his last request that his son be treated as a hero. A request which this council has consistently ignored. When they weren't actively betraying it, he finished off pointedly, causing the assembled clan heads to stir uncomfortably in their seats. We didn't know, one of them blurted out defensively. You knew enough, Sarutobi retorted, striking while the iron was hot. Even if you cared nothing for the fourth Hokage or his wishes, there is still the fact that all of you here know enough about seals to know that a demon could not have been contained without a child to seal it into. Naruto is just as much responsible for saving us all from the nine-tailed fox as his father. There was much uncomfortable stirring and glancing about among the members of that august body. Sarutobi blew out another cloud of smoke. Naruto's ancestry could not have been revealed without a danger to his life. Erasure made far too many enemies at home and abroad during his exploits that made him qualify for the office. It was my intention not to reveal his parentage until the boy was able to protect himself in his own right from the enemies he would inherit, and I'd hoped by that point he'd also have a loyal team to stand by him, either of which is the case now. The boy is outcast even among his own teammates. He gave them a pointed glare, while they did their best to avoid meeting his gaze. Most of them had at one point or another subtly worked to encourage people to ostracize the boy, and those who hadn't done it themselves knew that it was going on, could have worked to stop it, and hadn't. Those of them who had been ninja, which was by far the majority, began to consider, for the first time in their lives, what it would be like to have a team that hated you, and most could not imagine it. Their teams had made up their closest and most precious friends over most of their lives. They started to squirm as they realized that was just a bit of the damage they'd done, both to the boy and the memory of possibly the most cherished hero of Konoha. One of those, who owned a chain of shops and had always nurtured a secret pride over how much money he'd managed to chisel out of the boy, began to feel that high percentage of the orphan's allowance he'd effectively stolen, and always felt a trophy of his own personal victory over the Kyuubi, turned to ash and lead in his mind. He'd always before cherished the pain and poverty he'd caused Naruto, and now began to feel decidedly ill inside, as he'd once counted himself a friend of Erasure Kazama and had taken that revenge out on the child in his old friend's name. Then he began to consider the special kunai he'd commissioned to sell to the child the worst it was possible to make that still looked normal. That man was not alone among them in having his face turn white in shame. There were many others among them who'd done the same type of deeds in their own particular ways. True remorse of conscience began to appear in that room. Sarutobi sighed, feeling tired, saddened that it had taken this to change their minds concerning Arashi's child. It was my intent not to tell Naruto until he was far more prepared to protect himself. But in a careless slip of the tongue, I told him enough today that he was able to figure out the rest. His skills are remarkable, despite his lack of training, and others who've acted deliberately to hold him back. He gave several council members, particularly those with influence over the Ninja Academy, pointed looks of disapproval. They all squirmed beneath that glare. The Hokage leaned back in his chair, replacing his pipe and sucking on it. I will, of course, be releasing Arashi's house and scrolls to the boy. Now that he has the dangers, he may as well enjoy the benefits. There came a complete lack of disagreement from others in that chamber. The results of this news being confessed by guilty, shamefaced, remorseful clan heads in private to their own respective clans was far different to having the Hokage declare it to an angry and confused town. The remorse felt by their own clan heads transmitted down to those who had obeyed their orders to mistreat the boy or shun him. They felt their own guilt and shame over their treatment of him, and the encouragement they gave to others to do so. And it all made them so unhappy that they resolved to treat him better, and the tests went swimmingly. Then they made him, and the resets ended, and they all lived happily ever after until Akatsuki conquered the world and made them all into slaves. The end. The results of this news being confessed by guilty, shamefaced, remorseful clan heads in private to their own respective clans was far different to having the Hokage declare it to an angry and confused town. The remorse felt by their own clan heads transmitted down to those who had obeyed their orders to mistreat the boy or shun him. They felt their own guilt and shame over their treatment of him, and the encouragement they gave to others to do so. It was hard to reverse the habits of a lifetime, but slowly, as those people realized what they'd done, they began to realize just to what extent they'd hurt someone who was entirely innocent of hurting them, and the remorse began to kick in. The first time Naruto got a shy smile from an average citizen, it scared him to death. Nothing like that had ever happened before, and he didn't know how to deal with it. It seemed far more likely to be the bait for some form of trap, and he instantly went on guard and began looking around for where the trouble was going to come from. After shouting, "I never did anything to you," as a way of covering himself from future blame, Naruto ran off, slightly panicked. It made that citizen sick inside, and the many other villagers who had been watching were stunned. Had they really been so bad? Virtually all of them had heard the news of the boy's parentage by then. Most of them were unsure how they felt about it. But seeing the boy's instant defensive reaction to a simple smile was disheartening to say the least. Has anyone ever smiled at the boy before? Surely someone had. Then one little girl innocently asked, "Who?" And they were all stumped. Every one of them imagined someone else had done it at some point, but when it came right down to admitting it, none could say they'd done it, and that began to trigger a very depressing reaction, as they realized, most of them for the first time, just what a very hostile life the son of their hero had lived. And that every one of them were partly responsible for the environment he'd grown up in, where a simple smile was so out of place as to trigger an instant fear reaction. Their shame of having done that to him began to build. Naruto would have cared more about this if he'd known more of what was going on. As it was, he did what he'd grown used to doing every day, and trained hard to be a better ninja. It had been said before but really ought to be repeated. The child had no friends and no life, no hobbies, and if it had been possible for him to learn nothing but ninja skills, he would have. All of those crafts and trades he'd picked up had been results of sheer boredom or some other pressing need. As for friends, he had people he liked that he even considered friends, but at the start of each repeat they'd be back to treating him the way they had before. There was no one there to really understand him, no one to relate to him, and none to just hang out with on a regular basis without tedium setting in when they couldn't, change their reactions. Really, without something to stabilize himself, the boy was approaching burnout. He'd been under a great deal of strain through most of his life, and the resets hadn't materially improved his social standing. Even now, with most of the village beginning to feel sorrowful over their treatment of him, it did little more than wig him out. He wasn't used to dealing with it. I didn't know how to deal with it, to be honest. So, he avoided them to bury himself in his training. The Hokage noticed this, scrying the boy through his crystal ball, and felt sorrow. He hadn't believed that they'd gotten to the boy to damage him so severely. But it was apparent now that they had. He'd only just missed it. But it was night, and very late at that. Since the second stage of the exams began tomorrow, he'd have to wait on giving him access to his father's scrolls and property. He'd make it a surprise for the end of the second test. At the same time, he could reveal the team's new teacher. Naruto was aiming for a Kiba repeat, when he could hang out with the Inuzuka clan for a month or so, training under Kurenai for a reset or so, until he could face the thought of doing some wedding resets again. However, to his surprise, although he followed the Get Kiba as my opponent pattern to the letter, not telling Tenten any news of the upcoming test so Sasuke would not seek out Gaara, leaving them with the Orochimaru fight and the subsequent stuff leading up to him facing Kiba. Naruto found himself in the ring facing Sasuke for the prelims. Sending a shocked face over to the Hokage, Naruto saw Kakashi standing there by the scoreboard, and understood. Arashi's child had finally begun to understand more of his original teacher, as he'd had to spend enough time around the lazy ninja to do it. Anko had been right. The man was living in his past, but while that was correct, it wasn't quite all of it. No one could deny that Kakashi was hung up on the death of his former teammate Obito. What Naruto thought was that, to Kakashi, Sasuke was a combination of Kakashi when he was young, and Obito. The lazy nun was doing his best to seek redemption for his own past by building up Sasuke, and didn't much care what it cost anyone else for him to do it. He wasn't thinking about those others, he was fixated on Sasuke. For some reason, the man kept trying to redeem his own past mistakes, and the debt he felt he owed to Obito, by paying those off to Sasuke, making him his avatar, hoping he would fulfill the way things ought to have gone, trying to make it all right so he could forgive himself of his own mistakes. Not that the last Uchiha appreciated those subtleties. In a way, it was amazing how much those two were alike. It reminded Naruto of something he'd once heard, long ago in those far-gone pre-reset days, that a person all wrapped up in themselves makes a very small package. Kakashi was fixated on his past, particularly Obito, while Sasuke was the same, also fixated on his past, although in his case it was his brother and his clan that filled every waking thought. And both, in their own ways, were miserable and by their self-focus helping to make those around them unhappy. It wasn't as if either had made a choice to be hurting those around them, nor did either think they were all that bad. They were both inconsiderate because in their minds there was no room to consider anything outside of their narrow focus. If you had no place in their plans, then you had no value to them. But now that Kakashi had a grudge against Naruto for denying him a chance to pander to the stuck-up Uchiha prodigy anymore, they had evidently decided to use Sasuke as his avatar to avenge this slight as well as his past. Begin! The head examiner slashed his arm down, commencing the fight. Naruto threw down a trio of smoke grenades, hoping to cloud the area to use his jutsu without the Uchiha stealing them. However, it turned out to be better for Sasuke than for him, as none of the examiners caught the Uchiha activating the curse seal along with the Sharingan, and Sasuke was upon him before Naruto had even got the first-hand seal of his next move completed. After that, it was pretty much over. Sasuke copied over a dozen of Naruto's ninja techniques. And because of the Sharingan's ability to predict, Naruto couldn't get away, couldn't land a hit, and couldn't complete a ninja technique unless Sasuke let him because the Uchiha wanted to copy it. Sasuke had already closed the range to fist fighting, and he learned enough from stealing Lee's style to make that painful. Nor, with the curse seal affecting his mind, was Sasuke at all restrained. Naruto spent the rest of that day in the hospital, after having a kunai pulled out from his head. He never even got to meet his new teacher or see the scrolls his father had left him. Then the reset happened. Naruto had a plan. It was an evil, awful, and thoroughly wicked plan. It was never something he would have condoned under any circumstances whatsoever except this one, where the patient wouldn't even remember the harm he'd done, because it would all be undone with the next reset. So, beat him, jail him, rob him blind, the village could all get as upset as they wanted over it. This sort of thing would guarantee his failure at the exam, so it'd all be over in the morning anyway. The plan was not very complicated. It was, however, extremely risky. First, it involved finding Kakashi. This was not hard, as the guy spent half of every day staring at a monument. In the infinite time loops since, he'd even discovered what his teacher was doing there, recalling his teammate whose death had changed him, and whose dying wish had been to give Kakashi one of his Sharingan eyes, Obito Uchiha. He'd also discovered that bugging Kakashi for training while he was staring at the memorial stone was a sure path to pain and injury. Bugging Kakashi for training was nothing new to Naruto, he'd done it ever since that had become his official instructor. He'd chosen to do the bugging because, no matter that the man had a job to teach him, he never actually taught them anything, except the once with the tree climbing thing, and even then he'd just shown them that it could be done, then told them to do it and walked away without any explanation whatsoever. So, in a way, as his joint instructor, Kakashi even owed it to him. It required something like 3 resets to get right. So, bright and early in the morning before the written test, Naruto headed over there and gave a hearty cry to Kakashi, calling out that he wanted training. The blow he got would knock him out for hours. Fortunately, Naruto had already seeded the area with clones, who watched and took notes, from several angles, on the precise nature and direction of the fully expected blow. Why? Because it would be delivered exactly that way again after the reset, provided the other variables were kept consistent. So, bright and early the next morning, at exactly the same time as before and following the same path, he'd called out the same words to Kakashi, to prove that he could keep all of the details consistent. Sure enough, the blow came exactly the same way. That set things up for the third day, where everything proceeded exactly according to the pattern set out before, only with two important differences from the last time. The first was that it was a clone that approached and called out to Kakashi. This was because the real Naruto planned to be busy all that day and couldn't afford to be knocked out for hours. But it was impossible even for advanced bloodlines to tell the difference between the real him and a shadow clone before the first hit had landed, so that was alright. No, it was the second change that was important. A seal painted precisely over the point of impact that released several hundred cc's of high-potency knockout drugs obtained at the hospital into the Jonin's system the moment he touched it. If his Sharingan eye had been uncovered, he would have noticed it, even written in orange ink that precisely matched the clone's clothing, as it was. But his eyes weren't open. As always, he'd kept his special eye covered up behind his headband until he thought he'd really had a use for it, and beating up an unskilled genin didn't count. Caught entirely by surprise, the dropped like a rock. Before the cloud of smoke from the first clone's dispersal was finished, one of Naruto's other clones had performed the body switch technique with the fallen, and used transformation to become his virtual twin. That got the real job and transferred to the clone's former location, safely undercover and out of sight, while the clone replacement took Kakashi's place staring at the monument, and trying to disguise how bored he was. If this was starting to sound as highly planned and orchestrated as a bank robbery, that's probably because it was, and that for very good reason. He was going to rob Kakashi. In fact, Naruto was going to take away his most precious possession, and that wasn't his Aika. No, the genin made doubly sure his teacher was both bound and sedated, then activated his chakra scalpels and went to work extracting his Sharingan eye. One of his clones would then do the reverse, and insert the eye into Naruto, a fairly basic part of the advanced medical training he was getting. Transplants were needed with some frequency amongst ninja, and they got to those classes early. Naruto did this because he needed it, and his teacher would get it back after the next reset anyway. He'd literally never know he'd been missing it. The boy would never do this ordinarily, but he was beginning to feel desperate. Because Naruto had a theory. He had no idea if it was correct or not, that's why it was a theory and not a proven fact. Its basis was simply this: time after time he'd witnessed Sasuke gain Lee's fighting style simply by watching him use it. That had been enough to get him curious, but on careful questioning of him later, Naruto learned that the Uchiha didn't have a proper mental grasp of all of the whys and wherefores that went into the forms, he just did them. Like a reflex. That thought was enough to get Naruto practically possessed for a chance to try out his idea. It could remove the one major blockage he'd encountered and set his feet once again on the path to becoming a Kage-level ninja. But he never acted on that because, until now, he never had the medical skill or chakra control to pull it off successfully. It wasn't like he could just drag his unconscious teacher into Konoha's hospital and demand a transplant of Kakashi's eye. The village pariah had been able to master his desire to do this until he'd largely been able to forget about it up until Sasuke had used his Sharingan against him in their last fight. That pretty much pulled off the gloves. Sasuke wasn't on his nice guy list anymore. Naruto had paid in sweat, blood and tears for those techniques, only to have the Uchiha take them from him as if anything he wanted was his by right, just because he was an Uchiha. So there was a bit of petty revenge in doing this, but there was also a higher purpose. The Sharingan copied things. Everybody knew that. Training under Ebisu had made it painfully clear to Naruto that there was a world of difference between merely knowing a technique and having fully mastered it. He'd also observed this himself directly getting beaten up by Sasuke, and when he'd seen Kakashi use copied techniques, they were far from fully mastered. Kakashi and Sasuke didn't have to think about what they were doing when they used a copied form or technique. Nor did any of the knowledge behind them copy over. They were simply automatic. That meant they were reflexive. The fact that they didn't have full mastery at once suggested that copied skills were only reflexes, like the Sharingan had copied those skills directly into their muscle memories. They hadn't truly learned them until they'd also mastered the mental parts. But the time-looping boy needs reflexes in order to complete or progress in many of his skills. He'd already mastered the mental parts, at least as far as he could get until he could also get the physical stuff mastered. So, he needed the Sharingan, even if only to try out his little theory. Deciding to do it after Sasuke and Kakashi had both turned against him in that test was easy. He knew of only two sources of the Sharingan, and of those two, both were vulnerable to a properly set up ambush, so both were available, but Kakashi owed him instruction and Sasuke didn't. Besides, to avoid anyone noticing what had happened until Naruto was finished, the boy was planning on having one of his clones impersonate the victim until that reset was over. And of the two, it was easier to stare at a rock and be lazy than it was to fight Orochimaru and deal with fangirls. The procedure to extract one of his own eyes and implant the Sharingan was not exactly pleasant, even under sedation. Still, his healing factor kicked in right away and dealt with the headache soon enough. After that, Naruto was looking out on the world through a copycat eye. It was weird, everything was strange when viewed through the Sharingan. Immediately retiring to a safe place, the Forest of Death was surprisingly good for this, as no one went there casually, and the official stuff wasn't due to go there till tomorrow. The blonde genin formed hundreds of clones and sat very carefully observing them while they went through his whole range of ninja techniques and martial arts moves, splayed out in such a way so that he could observe them from every angle. It went surprisingly quickly. Body switch, clone, transformation and body flicker took mere seconds. Shadow clone technique he hadn't learned anything extra on since beginning the resets. Sexy and harem techniques were based on others he had already copied remastered versions for, but he copied them again anyway. After that, it was a good solid hour of watching his clones perform the forms of the martial arts he knew of, all careful to do them exactly so he wouldn't be memorizing any errors, before launching into sparring. Then they played with instruments lifted from the not yet open music shop, performed all of the stitches and hammering they knew of, and it was over, they were done. Even after repeating everything just to be sure, the whole thing had taken almost none of the time he'd imagined it would, and he could feel it taking hold. It was a most odd sensation, hard to describe, like goo sliding down the inside of your limbs, coating your muscles from within, as the Sharingan copied those moves. Dispersing those clones, he formed others with the new set possessing the same change he himself had just undergone. And when they fell to sparring, both their minds and their bodies knew the style, making them all at least double the speed he'd been when it had merely been his mind forcing his body through the techniques. So the experiment was a success. And though reflexes may be recorded by the muscles, they are recorded on the nerves. So if the nerves of his mind could recall stuff despite a reset, then the ones in his arms and legs ought to as well. And so it proved. It was an amazing victory. He could never be as strong or as fast as the Uchiha was with the cursed seal on. Heck, he wasn't even the equal to many of the dedicated martial arts specialists his age. Kyuubi's decorating may have given him a boost in those areas, but it had been added on top of close to nothing. Still, having imprinted the wanted reflexes via the Sharingan had unblocked him. He could progress in music and martial arts and other physical skills again. He was even a few fractions of a second faster on his basic 3 ninja techniques, which, considering how fast he'd been before, squeezing even the slightest improvement out on those was quite remarkable. But he'd done it, and what's more, he'd improved his ability to use those while in pain or otherwise distracted because the body could afford to do them almost on autopilot while his mind was busy dealing with those distractions. That was about as solid as anyone could ever get those basic ninja skills to be. More would be asking for the moon. However, it was the sudden progress of his long-stagnated fighting skills that were the real source of joy to the boy. Everything he did could benefit by having better martial arts skills. It was one of those things he'd been drawn to early on, and that had consistently paid off whenever he'd been able to get any better at it. Now, according to those fighting instructors he'd sought out so long ago, he ought to be twice as good as he'd been before, even while having the same level of knowledge. Just having his body know those moves as well as his mind did ought to double his prowess, according to them. And having double the top rookie genin fighting ability he'd been stuck at, ought to be enough to qualify him for about as good as a rookie ought to be, taking away a major handicap from him. Now he could work on thinking tactically because the complex motions of the actual forms, the stances, punches, blocks and so on, were automatic. His body could react faster, and could carry through on those motions without needing any input from his mind guiding them along, freeing that resource up to be plotting ahead to the next moves. No wonder the Uchiha felt so invincible. Suddenly saddened by that thought, Naruto considered something. He'd run through all he'd intended to do with this eye already. There was nothing else on his list, except maybe to watch his clones spar some more, but that didn't really feel productive. Deciding to continue on with his Foxy Bits experiments, and discovering that it was still early enough to get to the testing center if he hurried, the boy threw on a disguise technique to look like a normal Naruto and ran off. By tagging different people with his tail, he was learning to track multiple targets simultaneously, and across wider distances. That was an experiment worth continuing, and the best, widest distributed, most interesting group to track was his fellow hopefuls. The loser of Team 7 had once gotten Ebisu to admit to what ranking he had for chakra capacity, as opposed to his ever-pathetic chakra control that all of his teachers kept riding him for. Ebisu had fought tooth and nail against telling him, fighting it like he was going to die if he gave up the secret. In the end, the answer came only through him tricking the teaching specialist into revealing how chakra capacity could be measured, one tidbit at a time, until he'd assembled the whole process and could measure himself. He was Kage level, easily. More to the point, he'd been Kage level on chakra capacity even before he'd begun the time loop he was now caught in. The amount of shadow clones he used alone was proof of that. What's more, this was known to every, and most of the, in Konoha. Why they'd rather give up along than tell him, though, the blonde didn't know. Maybe it was one of those laws the Hokage had passed to protect him. But maybe it was something else, or something that Kakashi had done. He didn't know. What he did know was that it was a real pain to have so little critical information concerning himself. Maybe that whole know thyself and thy enemy thing had another edge to it after all. It wasn't like the outcome of any of his fights with Orochimaru was in doubt, though would always kill him and the boy would always die. It was possible, Naruto felt, that he didn't know himself as well as he thought. It seemed there was always stuff about him turning up he didn't know, and he didn't know, but that turned out to be important. And why keep it from him anyway? No one had any problem telling Sakura she had perfect chakra control. And if anyone even thought that the Uchiha had a Kage-level chakra capacity, they'd never be able to shut up about it. It would be shouted from the rooftops, and they'd probably have parades to celebrate the discovery. But no, every teacher he'd had so far had told him how his chakra control kept him from learning this or that, but no one ever taught him the sort of things that massive chakra capacity was good for. Want someone to body flicker from one end of Konoha to the other without stopping in between? Fine. He could do that. He wouldn't even feel the drain. Need the Hokage monument moved west 11 feet? Teach him a technique and he'd give it a try. But no, they didn't. Rather than lean to his strength, they endlessly used his weakness as an excuse not to teach him, mostly probably because Kakashi had told them to. They hadn't even told him he had a strength. They let people like Sakura call him useless, and stood by doing nothing, as if they agreed. There had to be other people in Konoha with average chakra control, right? That's why they call it average, don't they? Because that's what most people have. So they had to have something for those ninja to do, right? Why couldn't he do that? He'd probably be good at it. Instead, he'd had to bounce around a dozen tasks he wasn't all that good at naturally, just to have something to use his time on. Heck. The pink-haired fangirl had perfect control because she had practically no chakra to begin with. It's easy to be exact with an eyedropper. On the other hand, Naruto had been a streaming fire hose. Wrestling to get the thing on target at all was a major achievement. That he'd achieved something close to accuracy with it should have been celebrated as a marvelous accomplishment. And then he'd managed to get the same level of control out of a freaking geyser. He knew by now he had better control than Sasuke did or ever had. And he'd always had dozens of times the chakra capacity of the other guy. Yet they celebrated the Uchiha and despised him. Oh, he knew why. The one was the precious Uchiha, the other was the demon container, the village pariah, the hated Uzumaki. Still, he'd hoped some of it, at least, could look past that. But he guessed not. Not with Kakashi telling them not to, lest it interrupt his training with him. As if he'd ever taught anything. All of this was getting rather far afield, however. Naruto had begun this time loop thing with Kage-level chakra reservoirs, but chakra was composed of mind and body energies. His mind energies stank, or had stunk. Practically all of that amazing chakra capacity had been body energy alone. And well, after he'd begun teaching himself things and overcoming mental blocks, that wasn't the case anymore. His mind energies were growing. They weren't Kage level yet, but they were getting there, and he didn't hesitate to call his purely academic ninja abilities roughly level. With his physical limits the way they'd been, there wasn't a great deal he could do other than to teach himself things and learn to use his mind. And what this did to his chakra reserves was predictable. They'd been shooting up, and up, and up the entire time he'd been trapped in this loop developing his mind. He didn't have a rank for them anymore, they blew off the tops of the charts, somewhere way above Kage level and rising with no limits in sight. And then, of course, the Kyuubi had gone and added to them. Naruto didn't even feel the drain of having an open and active Sharingan eye as he went to rush off to the testing center. In fact, he'd forgotten all about it, so used to and conditioned by the resets to move on past something once he'd completed his plans concerning it that it never even entered his head what to do with it after he was done. Naruto barely got to the building on time for his usual arrival, which meant that he'd had no time to do all of those useful pre-arrival things like get to Hinata-chan and make her blush, visit the Hokage to wheedle out the Uchiha estate, and so on. But still, on time was on time, and he didn't have to get those things. Luckily, Sakura was too busy cooing over Sasuke to glare at him, as he wasn't all that late. So they went into the building together, breezed by those two Chunin with the disguise door, and Naruto, already having the disguise and veil techniques they were using, didn't even notice the slight putting down my limbs sensation caused by seeing them, and were on their way to the room they were after when Lee appeared to give his challenge to Sasuke. That's right. No Hinata this morning, so that meant Lee would proceed with his challenge against Sasuke, trying to prove that hard work was superior to being a genius. Sasuke got most of his later accomplishments in martial arts out of this fight. His skills were solidly genuine before this, and didn't impress Orochimaru no matter how ticked off Naruto got him. The jerk had stolen Lee's pride and joy, his fighting style, then renamed it, and used it as if it was his own. Naruto had also copied a few moves out of this fight, which was impressive, as he never had the Sharingan. The sole blonde present stood frozen as Lee finished off his fight sequence, and when he recovered from his shocked and frozen state he started to inwardly berate himself. Darn it! Now he was getting as bad as Sasuke. It was one thing to copy Lee's moves when he was just using hard work. The chakra-disabled ninja respected nothing like he respected that. Hard work was what he lived for. But to steal those hard-won abilities using a bloodline, that was just cheating. And Naruto had forgotten until that fight was over that he'd had a Sharingan up and active. Inside himself, the blonde resolved to make this up to Lee somehow, and as some of his most recent advances were in the field of medicine, he chose to try the impossible. He would reconstruct Lee's chakra coils so the brave, if odd, green-clad genin could mold chakra as well as anyone else. One of his medical instructors had actually used Lee's case as an example of procedures too dangerous to pursue, granting him only a 1 in 10,000 chance of being cured, even using dangerous, experimental techniques. Naruto drew in a deep breath and firmed up his resolve, promising himself that he could do it anyway. After all, if it took him 10,000 resets to get that 10,000 to 1 chance, in the end he'd still learn how to do it. The clone's shape shifted into Kakashi's form, met them all at the door, gave them Kakashi's lines in a very Kakashi manner, then disappeared off to go follow Kurenai to what he assumed was the Jonin lounge. Smirking, Naruto sent a few fox-shaped clones throughout the class as the Chunin hopefuls were milling about before Ibiki called them all to order. Then, once everyone was in their seats and he and Hinata were noisily making out at the front of the class, tests already completed, the explosive tags those clones had set on certain chairs went off, catapulting Kabuto and others out of their blast zones, overturning desks and raining debris over a wide area. The silver-haired traitor had gotten embedded in the ceiling, neck broken, but living. Many of the other hopefuls were also in critical condition. But they were all very bad people. Laughing inside, Naruto went off to the hospital as a concerned friend with Kabuto too out of it to say otherwise. The unconscious traitor was not able to use his regeneration technique, so by staying by the side of him, as well as Kabuto's team and other casualties, Naruto was able to observe close at hand while the Konoha medics used a wide assortment of emergency medical jutsu to stabilize the wounded. Then, by impersonating a nurse, he was able to observe them throughout surgery, and then beyond, picking up a complete inventory of techniques of which he'd known the theory for simply years, but hadn't yet mastered as far as the practical side of things. Flitting in and about as they treated the host of wounded, plus the ordinary flow of that hospital they'd normally see, Naruto's education into the medical arts expanded by leaps and bounds. Assuming the identity of a female doctor to walk out of the place, Naruto even got drafted to help on the still critical rush of wounded, and found him slash herself using those techniques on the female genin from Sound, who'd had a substantial portion of her ribcage crushed and pelvis shattered, with some possible damage to the spine. Figuring the worst she could do would be kill her, and that the Sound genin was an enemy anyway, and thus, it would be no shame if she died, Naruto set about using those techniques she had recently caught. It turned out to be an enlightening experience. The Sound genin even lived though her efforts. From the successful effort, the disguised young boy then got drafted in to help on other cases, getting more surgical assignments and assisting with even better doctors, until he'd spent the whole afternoon undercover at the hospital learning what they did there to treat injuries. It was not all chakra control, or even book knowledge. Knowing what he did about anatomy helped more than he would have supposed, but his experience so far had always been with girls whose skins had been intact, and they looked really different on the inside. They were filled with icky goo, for the most part. Not very pretty at all. Still, having his cherry popped as an emergency medic, so to speak, the boy dragged himself home to sleep long and hard, only to be woken in the morning by Sakura, who'd been worried over not seeing him after the test the other day, and so come to check on him to make sure he got to the second test on time. That was a first. Wait a minute, Naruto sat up, rubbing at his eyes. You mean I actually passed? What with all that was going on, the head examiner didn't give the 10th question, Sakura blurted, shoving his clothes at them, then locking him in his bathroom. You scored 9 out of 9, although how you did it is beyond me. I was certain those questions were above you. I cheated off of Hinata, he answered absently, getting dressed as quickly as possible. He'd have to use a camping jutsu to bathe later on, when he had more time. He still could hardly believe he'd passed. That had not been his intention. He'd just filled in those answers as usual to avoid stressing out Hinata, then gone off with those medics to pirate some healing skills. Apparently things got resolved favorably in his absence. He'd not been expecting it. Pausing, the boy's eyes lit up. If they were going to the forest, that meant they'd soon be fighting against Orochimaru. Oh yeah! He could use this new advantage to see through some of the Snake Freak's ninja techniques, and Naruto had absolutely no problem stealing from an enemy. That meant there were 1 or 2 other fights in that forest he really ought to get an eye on. And, knowing the various times during which those happened, having observed them all at least once before, he could do it if he gave a prodigious waste of chakra on body flickers. Hee hee hee. Sprinkling rain of Saban needles, here we come. By the time the preliminary tests arrived, Naruto was feeling bloated. He'd stolen techniques from half of the Chunin hopefuls, some of those by accident as they'd been used by Konoha ninja fighting outright enemies of Konoha, and somehow he was planning to make those up to them somehow. The boy wrote himself a blanket check, saying within himself that saving the village from the upcoming invasion would cover those thefts from Konoha, although how he was going to repay Kankuro for stealing that illusion he used to disguise his puppet as himself was a puzzle. Actually, there was more to it than that, as he'd quite by accident stolen most of the puppet user's basic arsenal while they'd been fighting other teams. More than he'd gotten out of the boy during conversation anyway. How he was going to make that up to the older boy he didn't know, so he chalked it up as a debt to be paid and resolved to think more on it later. Now he had to get himself a fan like Tamari had. Those moves of hers were cool. And speaking as her husband, even if that wasn't true in this reset, he felt he had a right to her techniques, so long as he shared his in return. That was fair, wasn't it? Then the prelim fight started, and Naruto gazed intently on that guy who drained chakra, knowing as he did so how useful that technique would be to defeat Niji, if he ever had to fight the Hyuga genius again, which was likely. It wasn't unavoidable. Drawing numbered stones out that bag to determine who fought who in the first rounds of the finals gave him just enough control to influence that to be fighting someone else. And then the invasion would happen to curtail any further matches. But still, Having the ability to do so at need gave him a better chance to avenge Hinata without getting beaten up himself. He didn't learn much from watching the chakra-draining genin. What the guy did was mostly safe from the Sharingan, but that was okay. He learned enough that with a lot of hard work, maybe he could reconstruct that technique himself from scratch. Then Naruto appeared, watching very closely as Hinata fought her cousin Neji, cheering on his pale-haired beloved until she fought with the best she had. She'd lose, she always did in these prelims fighting against her cousin, but with what he'd learned by watching her, Naruto could now be far more confident of his ability to impersonate her should she need a stand-in in future matches, like he'd done with her at their wedding. And he also got to analyze Niji's style, and perhaps he could learn later how to train her to fight against it. Naruto couldn't use the gentle fist style, as it required their bloodline, but a wicked gleam came to the blonde boy's eyes. He'd never be as strong or as fast as the real close combat fighters who had trained for this all of their lives. The resets made that impossible. But the push chakra out through your fingers part of the gentle fist style just sounded like a good chakra control exercise that ought to benefit him whether or not he could make anything else of it. And bloodlines could be stolen, couldn't they? I mean, there he was watching this fight through a Sharingan eye. He was going to be doing the research on bloodline theft just because Tenten had asked him to, that reset where they'd gotten married. And so long as he was going to be a donor, granting his gifts to his wives, then maybe Hinata, once she had his regeneration, wouldn't mind letting him and her sister wives have her bloodline too? That could be dead useful. No need to trick people into being anatomy models for one, or playing around with corpses or whatever those medics did to get their first-hand knowledge of internal anatomy. They can't all have started that side of their studies with their hands already on a desperately wounded patient, could they? No, they couldn't. It wasn't possible. Naruto had tried learning his operating on clones, but that was useless, as they vanished the moment their bodies got disrupted. However, the boys' planning got cut short, as the head examiner called out the next match. Between all those he'd wounded with tags previous to this, and the consequent mix-up of losses in the forest, there had been an unequal number of strong versus weak Chunin hopefuls arrived to the preliminaries, and the Hokage thought he was being kind to Naruto, giving him his own weak opponent so he'd have a chance to advance to the finals. Too bad that weak opponent chosen for him was Lee. After having been beaten about by a wrecking ball moving at pinball speeds, Naruto decided that it was probably for the best, as the Sharingan was just way too addictive, and considering what he knew of those who had it, if he'd kept it for much longer it would obviously make him stupid, or at least lazy. Meanwhile, the Kakashi clone had been having a somewhat interesting week. All he'd had to do was disguise a science text in an orange cover, and no one looked at him at all funny when he was reading in public. Okay, they looked at him funny, but it was a "how dare you, you pervert" sort of funny, instead of a "why is he doing that" sort of funny. People knew why Kakashi did that. It was because he was pervy. So at least the week hadn't been a total loss, as he'd gotten some good reading done. Naruto had had to replace the clone impersonating Kakashi at least once a day, more if it had used any techniques. But considering how lazy that Jonin was, it had been easy enough not to most of the time, and he'd gotten to learn tons of things while doing it. For example, the clones tending the real Kakashi in the cave in which they'd kept him had gotten to see the guy's face under that mask he perennially wore. Not that it was all that interesting, you had the outline just glancing at the guy through the thin material. But still, it was an interesting goal to have achieved, just to say you'd done it. He'd also learned more about where they lived, and while Naruto had a place he'd made nice inside of a dump, his teacher was the opposite, living in a nice place that he made into a dump through laziness and not caring. Still, he'd gotten to see the broken bits of the famous sword of Kakashi's father, and that the Jonin had broken carelessly. Actually, the more he thought about it, the more he realized that Jonin lived a depressing life, and what made it worse to consider was the guy had basically chosen for it to be that way. When Team 7 had arrived out of the forest, Kakashi had gotten called upon to put a restraining seal over the one Orochimaru had placed on Sasuke. Picking the most likely seeming one he knew of from the NBU files, Kakashi had taken Sasuke aside to the room he knew the original always used, and began to emplace the seal, tapping into a hidden bag of pig's blood to use to write them, rather than cutting his own finger, because, as a clone, he knew that cutting his own finger would dispel him. He was basically done with the design, fascinated to watch the several yards across diagram pick itself up to compress into a much smaller space, and the possible extraneous uses for that, when Orochimaru appeared, gloating. And those boasts he made were very enlightening. So, how do you get two Piccolo players to play in tune? Naruto/Sasuke asked at his free, complimentary music lesson. You shoot one of the Piccolo players, the music teacher told him with a smile. Now let us go back to fingering those keys. You know, honestly, it never struck me before. The music teacher looked at the all-Piccolo band of some 30 or so Narutos, who were, incidentally, all playing in tune with one another. That all you'd really need is 30 or so of the same Piccolo player. Naruto skipped down the street, laughing loudly. He really loved having Kurenai as a teacher, he really did. Unfortunately, she was too fair a teacher for his purposes, as, after having spent 1 month-long repeat with her learning all he could, when the next time to be her student came around she carefully tested his knowledge, then told him frankly it would only take her a little over a month to bring her team up to speed with him, and that after that she'd prefer to teach them all together. Naruto was crushed. But she wasn't going to play favorites, and her team ought to know this information too. In a bunch of ways he could admire and respect her for it, and only wish his own instructor had been half that even-handed. But for his purposes it was awfully inconvenient, to say the least. Still, inconvenience was among the least of his woes. Naruto found he was fighting hard against the lure of the Sharingan. He'd never have believed it, but that thing was like a drug. Once you'd had it, there was this intense desire for more of it. He'd caught himself planning for more repeats like that last one, where he'd gone around behind a Sharingan learning more than he'd ever done before and at the same time horrified by how much he wanted this, because he knew that having mastered those techniques you already had made you a better and more effective ninja. But at the same time he felt this huge desire to forget about mastering any of this most recent haul and just go out rampantly stealing any and all techniques he could get anyone to demonstrate for, or even against, him, thinking about people he could attack and force to use moves on him. And that desire scared him. It came out of nowhere, and it was as much as he could do sometimes to stop himself from going up to Kakashi to bonk him on the head to pluck out and use that eye again. He'd even felt such an urge in public, before witnesses. He'd burgled enough houses during his cat burglar days to know that some things you got away with when no one was looking were just plain out when they were. He knew better than that. But this urge to pluck out and stick in another Sharingan was overpowering, and for that he gradually grew terrified of it, concerned because if he did this again, he might not be able to stop doing it always. And being a prisoner to his own urges was just wrong. He, who already had a prisoner in his body, thank you very much, didn't want to be another. He didn't want to join the Kyuubi in being enslaved to a body he was no longer master of. And so, much as it had helped him, the boy resolved to avoid the Sharingan in the future. It just got too dangerous. Those desires to make him keep it were very nearly overwhelming to the boy, and he didn't dare to risk any further temptation. He'd have to quit cold turkey, at least until he'd found a way to beat these desires for good. And while that was a disappointment in some ways, it was less so than it might have been. He'd already caught up on body skills to where his mind had gotten. He could sew, hammer or spar far more easily than before, as his body just took over on autopilot, needing only occasional direction from his brain. The same went for his techniques, and many of his basic ones were now up to where they'd be considered perfect, no improvement possible. And speaking of the Kyuubi, the old vixen had healed up considerably the last time he checked on her. Oh sure, she was still pretty beat up, but nothing like she had been. The rents in her coat had mostly closed now, and her rate of healing had accelerated, as if she had crossed some threshold from barely hanging on to getting better now. So it looked like he'd have someone to talk to soon, at any rate. Of course, for the immediate present, he had techniques to perfect, loads of them. He'd never even have guessed how many spying techniques were being used during that written test. Enko's entrance had contained a very highly skilled acrobatic maneuver that took more talent than he would have initially believed. Then there was the not-to-be-overlooked way that Lee fought, or what he'd picked up from Guy that time he'd stopped his prize pupil from pulverizing Sasuke. He owed it to those two to pick up as much of the mental aspect of their art as they would let him. It was only fair to figure out why you moved this way instead of that, and all of those niggling little details. It was their art, after all, and they were far from his enemies, so that meant he had to respect how they wanted their art to be seen and used. He wasn't about to run about wearing green spandex, but putting in some hard work as a tribute to their own was the least of what he could do. Then, of course, there were all of those lovely little ninja techniques that he'd picked up from observing those foreign shinobi fight during the forest part of the exam. And, not to be overlooked, all of those combat teachers he'd originally impersonated Sasuke to approach were now approachable. He could get new people to teach him again. Oh yes! He had good cause to cackle as he bounded merrily along. Thanks for watching, Shinobi Squad. If you enjoyed this What If, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss the next twist. Drop your theories in the comments, I'm always reading. Want more Naruto heat? Check out the other videos on the channel. Stay sharp, stay awesome, and remember even shadow clones need love. Peace out, Shinobi. Thanks for watching, Shinobi Squad. If you enjoyed this What If, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss the next twist. Drop your theories in the comments, I'm always reading. Want more Naruto heat? Check out the other videos on the channel. Stay sharp, stay awesome, and remember even shadow clones need love. Peace out, Shinobi.